from Warrior Is by Harley and Robin Zephyr. It's the story of their great-grandfather who, in real life, killed Custer at Little Bighorn. And in fact, there's a map of the war, as it were, the battle. And they say that he is now the spirit keeper of Custer, which is remarkable. And there's a page-and-a-half introduction to the book, and then it becomes, a historically accurate novel, basically. This story is the traditional and cultural account of the life of Nikogju Lakota warrior Mato Nyanpi, saved by Bear, which his name in English, also later known as Scarleg. Warrior is based upon a true story. What you are about to read has been told to us through our family, passed down as oral history from generation to generation. Every family has its own story. This is ours. It's up to you to visualize and experience the events described herein in order to determine what you believe or what you choose to accept from what you learn from these pages. You've likely never read a story quite like this before. In Warrior Is, the reader is able to visualize and experience the events and circumstances of Mato Nyanpi's life. Many times the story is told in the present tense, such as if you were walking with Saved by Bear and his people as the events unfold. This was our original manner of storytelling. Other times the story is narrated in the past tense to account for a past perspective. Those of us who may not be entirely fluent in particular words or specific language, as much as we may be fluent in spirit and honest communication, the life messages many times can be more meaningful than just the written or spoken words. Warrior Is follows the timeline from the time of creation, moving through Saved by Bear's birth in 1849, and going up to July 1876, 2 weeks after the Grass Battle. Please exercise your free will and follow your conscience when reading this story. The spiritual side is called upon you to open your spirit so that you may read this tale and learn about these events through your own spirit. And, continues sort of like in that line, but here, right to the book. Prologue. He smelled the yellow of the sun. His spirit was alive and energetic. He felt the energy in his chest and all along the blood running through his veins. He looked to his left to see his great friend by his side. The strong scent of sage caressed his nostrils and reminded him of home. The movement over the high-running hilly ridge to the south caught his eye. He and Swift Bear sensed and felt the pathway opening up. So much had occurred so quickly, so suddenly, so dramatically. Their call to duty, his call to duty, filled his mind, his heart, his spirit. Today, it was meant to happen. It was presented to the people from the Creator. The plan was made. The warriors summoned. The preparation was done. It all led to this place, this portal in time. The sparse clouds to the west resembled mare's tails, and for a brief moment he remembered his white stone friend in the White Mountains. He remembered his spiritual commitment to protect his people, Grandmother Earth, and the sacred Hisapa. And time stood still for a moment, a small moment in time, through all of the ancient and original history of all the moments of time. And as the group of the horse-mounted soldiers rode briskly over the far ridge, the Creator shined that warm, nurturing light upon these warriors. Such as Creator had been doing since the beginning of time, since the beginning of Grandmother Earth and Grandfather Sky, and at the beginning of all things. All the moments of time forever had arrived here, now. It had come to this. Creator's strong will and great invisible hand had placed them here. It was the Creator all along. It always was. It always would be. For one to know what led the young Lakota warriors to be here at this fateful site near the Greasy Grass River on this warm, sun-drenched day, one must go back in time, way back to the beginning, when it was only the Creator, and the Creator of all things decided to create a new world. Her name would be Unsimaka, Grandmother Earth, and she would be created to hold and sustain life. All kinds of beings, all kinds of people would be given and placed upon and within her to show her love of life. And this is how it all began. Chapter 1, Origin. The human beings evolved from the spirit. Before arriving in Wind Cave, we were star people. Many of us came from a place called the Pleiades, the Seven Sisters, an ancient star grouping and constellation that contains worlds comprised of the gift of life-giving water. Water is life. Mini Wikoni, The Pleiadian influence is an absolute, but those of us who claim to be relatives of the Pleiadians share a common bond with other indigenous people, regardless of where we are geographically on the earth. We will always remain Pleiadian star people. Spiritually, we have become human beings of different races and ethnicities, but the origin of our spirit is the water. And for us, and as to who we are, as the tribal people in a family way, our name is Minkoju, its evidence. It means life's subsistence through the gathering and planting by the waters and or river. The Minikoju spend their lives living by the waters. This is something that many of our own people do not know or understand, but this is our history, not only of our physical existence, but also the history of our spiritual existence on Unsimaka. The book is Warrior Is by Robin and Harley Zephyr.
With you in the second hour of our program today, for pretty much the whole hour, we're going to be talking with Craig Unger. He's got a new book out, American KOMPROMAT, about Donald Trump and you know, his history, where he came from, what he's all about. It's absolutely chilling. So we'll get to that in the second hour. Our third hour, Barry C. Lynn is going to be with us about how monopolies have created a crisis in the food industry. And that'll just be one segment, again, a quick interview, and then we'll get back to your phone calls. This first hour, I want to talk with you about freedom. I think this is a really, really important issue, and it's something that Democrats have kind of missed the boat on. We haven't been talking, Democrats by and large have not been talking about freedom in the frame that traditionally progressive Democrats like Franklin Roosevelt and Lyndon Johnson, and even progressive Republicans like Teddy Roosevelt, talked about freedom. Teddy Roosevelt, back in 1912, proposed what he called the square deal that would include health insurance for everybody in the country that was paid for by the government, that would guarantee that everybody had the right to what he called a remunerative job, you know, a job that paid enough that you could get a decent, you know, you could have a decent life, that guaranteed everybody in America could take at least a week or two of vacation every year, that guaranteed education to everybody in America, including college education. This was the Republican president from 1901 to 1908, or 1909, March of 1909. Teddy Roosevelt proposed that. And he said that these things would guarantee the freedom of Americans. A generation later, his third cousin Franklin Roosevelt came into office and said essentially the same thing. It was in the 1940s. He gave a speech in which and you know, there was publication around it and all this other kind of stuff, in which he presented what he called his second Bill of Rights. He pointed out that the first Bill of Rights guaranteed freedom from government interference. That was his phrase, actually. And, you know, it limited the government from stopping our right to free speech or stopping our right to freedom of religion or freedom from religion. It limited the government from snooping on us with the Fourth Amendment. It limited the government from unfair prosecutions with the Fifth through the Eighth Amendment. You know, it limited the federal government from interfering in the states at certain levels with the Ninth and Tenth Amendments. And he said, you know, that was all well and good. You know, we had just fought a war against a monarchy, against a kingdom, for the right to establish our own government, but we did not want our government to have the kinds of power that the British government had had over its people. So we built all these protections against government into the Constitution. And he said that was all well and good, but now here we are, you know, 100 and some odd years later, with a new generation, and now we're confronted by a new set of royalists. That was the word that that Franklin Roosevelt used. He called them economic royalists. And he said these economic royalists are, you know, wrapping themselves in the flag. He said they say that they're pursuing freedom, but in fact what they're pursuing is essentially tyranny. So, I want to do a deep dive on this, you know, over the next 10 or 15 minutes and get your thoughts on what does freedom mean to you? What does that word mean to you? And how do we recalibrate this conversation in America about what freedom means? Republicans have been arguing that freedom means you don't have to wear a mask. Freedom means that your employer can pay you $7.25 an hour and fire you at will. Freedom means, according to conservatives, that your hospital is free to give you a surprise bill of $50,000 if you show up in the ER with COVID. Freedom, according to conservatives, means that you can go $100,000 in debt going to college. Freedom, according to conservatives, means that you've got potholes in your highways because you're not paying much taxes, or the rich people in your state are paying, like Donald Trump, no taxes. Or was it $700 one year? So what does freedom mean to you? Teddy, back to Franklin Roosevelt, FDR said that you have to have, in order to have freedom, there has to be a foundation on which free men and women can stand. Others have referred to that as the soil in which freedom can be rooted, or in which the free enterprise system can be rooted. I wrote about this over at thomhartmann.medium.com, and I think it's the biggest meme that the Democratic Party has missed so far. And I want to encourage elected Democrats to start talking about freedom. So Franklin Roosevelt said basically, if your kids are hungry, which is the case, and going to bed hungry, which is the case with 1 in 7 American families today, 1 in 6 families who rent, their children are going to bed hungry because they can't afford food. If your children are going to bed hungry, Franklin Roosevelt said, you are not free. If you want to improve your lot in life with a good education, going to a trade school or a college, and you can't afford to do it, you are not free. If you get in a car accident and you're injured and you can't afford to pay your hospital bill, or you get sick and you can't afford to, or you think you might be sick, you go, oh, there's a lump here, or I feel a pain there, but you're afraid to go in because you can't afford it, because you know you could get wiped out, because America is the home of medical debt and bankruptcy. We are literally the only developed country in the world where half of all bankruptcies are because somebody got sick in the family. Half. $500,000 a year. 600,000 a year. People go bankrupt because somebody got sick. That does not happen in Canada. It does not happen in England. It doesn't happen in France. It doesn't happen in Germany. It doesn't happen in Italy. It doesn't happen in Greece. It doesn't happen in Norway. It doesn't happen in Sweden. It doesn't happen in Finland. It doesn't happen in Estonia now, for God's sake. Former Soviet Republic. It doesn't happen in Latvia or Lithuania. It doesn't happen in any other developed world or nation in the world except here. And Franklin Roosevelt said, that's the opposite of freedom. You're not free if you don't have a job because COVID ran through your country, and people like Joe Manchin are lobbying. Literally, Joe Manchin is lobbying lobbying the Democrats to cut that $1,400 benefit back. It's too generous. The governor, the former Democratic governor, became a Republican, or maybe it was the other way around. Yeah, no, he became a Republican. Jim Justice, the guy, this wealthy man who's the governor of West Virginia, came out yesterday and said, basically, I don't know what the hell Joe Manchin is talking about, but he better get his damn act together. Because if you're broke because your job is gone or even on hold for 6 months or a year because of COVID, and you can't afford to feed your family, you're not free. Freedom is standing on a foundation made of education, health care, and economic security, which includes housing. These things, Franklin Roosevelt said, should be rights, not privileges. So what is freedom, and how do we reframe it? the billionaires and the right-wingers, freedom means you can bring a gun into the Capitol building. Freedom means I don't have to wear a damn mask if I'm going to cough on you. Is that freedom? Really? We'll be right back.
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
Let's talk about freedom. I'll be picking up your calls on this. Stick around. It's 15 minutes past the hour. And welcome back. David in San Francisco. Hey, David, what's on your mind today?
Hi, Tom. I'm glad you raised this economic royalists issue. I come from a family. John Hart of New Jersey signed the Declaration of Independence, and he was some great grandpa of mine. And we were always raised to understand that the monarchists have always been tricking America into doing the wrong thing. And, whether it was the War of 1812 or dividing the country in the Civil War or tricking America into protecting monarchists in World War I or the royalists in league with Hitler in World War II in order to put the monarchy back into Germany, that these, economic trickeries have been foisted on America for centuries. And that if we continue to listen to bad ideas, we're going to be, subject to ruining our republic. And I suppose you're probably familiar with the economics of food stamps, where $1 of a food stamp that comes into your county turns into $1.85. And so when you hear these Republicans...
Because it circulates through the local economy.
Yeah, exactly. So the
right, whereas a dollar spent at Walmart on junk made in China becomes less than a dollar because it immediately goes to China. But anyhow, back to you, David. Yes.
Right. Yeah.
I am familiar with
it leaves it leaves the county as soon as it comes into the as soon as it goes into Walmart's register, it goes to the corporate headquarters, which is basically the same mercantilism of 1776. But the idea that the stimulus money, for the Republicans to be cheap about putting stimulus money back into each county, they're basically starving the country. And, if you put $600 in instead of $300, it's going to basically double. And to be stingy about it means that you're starving these counties. So these Republicans actually don't even know basic conservative economics, much less that, if a corporation takes a piece of plastic and turns it into a product that they can turn into, 4 cents worth of plastic can turn into a $2 item, how come the taxpayer can't put the same amount of effort into multiplying the value of something into each local county? So they pretend that stimulus money is actually a drain when it's an opportunity of growth.
Mm-hmm. And that's how it works, and frankly, if we made, instead of making 80% of what we consume in the United States and China and other overseas countries, if we made the majority of what we produce or what we purchase here in the United States, it would have a much more massive stimulus effect. I mean, the pre-Reagan stimulus effect was so huge and so rapid, and now it's a little more diffuse. But you're absolutely right with food stamps; it's instantaneous. And again, something that the average American has no understanding of, because most people don't understand how economics works, much less politics. David, excellent points all. Thank you for calling and making those points. You said it very, very well. It's coming up on 20 minutes past the hour. I'll be back in just 1 minute with more of your calls and thoughts and mine on what does freedom mean here. Stick around. We'll be right back. You can find an absolutely fascinating library of my writings, including my daily rants, over at thomhartmann.medium.com. Hey, my new book is out. The Hidden History of American Oligarchy, Reclaiming Our Democracy from the Ruling Class. In this book, I trace the history of the struggle against oligarchy from America's founding to the United States' war with the feudal confederacy to President Franklin Roosevelt's struggle against economic royalists who wanted to block the New Deal. In each of those cases, the oligarchs lost the battle. But with increasing right-wing control, we're at a crisis point. Want to know more? You can sign up for 3 virtual book events. Powell's virtual event, In Conversation with David Korten, is Tuesday, February 2nd at 5 p.m. Pacific Time. The Seattle Town Hall virtual event is Thursday, February 4th at 6 p.m. Pacific Time. And the Books and Books virtual event, In Conversation with David Korten, is Tuesday, February 9th at 4 p.m. Pacific Time. Come support your local bookstores and hear about my new book on oligarchy. The links are all over at thomhartmann.com. Welcome back. Thom Hartmann here with you. It's just, you know, this freedom that billionaires in the Republican Party are selling us is just, this is crazy. You know, this week, day before yesterday, they were doing a vaccination thing at Dodger Stadium. And the headline I saw in the paper was anti-vaxxers shut down vaccine program, right? But when you read into the story, you discover that the guys who organized this, they called it the, quote, anti-lockdown freedom rally and march. And they said, we're not going to stop until we get our freedoms back. People who are opposing vaccinations of COVID. Because, Trump says it's a hoax? I mean, the guys who occupied the Michigan Capitol with assault weapons because they said Governor Whitmer's attempts to stop COVID from killing people in Michigan was an assault on their freedom. This is destroying our country. I mean, it's just gutting us. And don't forget, Ronald Reagan in 1960, 65, 66, 67, I think it was, when LBJ was trying to pass Medicare, Ronald Reagan said, and I quote, "If Medicare passes into law, the consequences will be dire beyond imagining. One of these days, you and I are going to spend our sunset years telling our children and our children's children what it was once like in America before Medicare when men were free." Right. What does freedom mean to you? Lawrence in St. Paul, Minnesota. Hey, Lawrence, what does freedom mean to you?
Hey, well, it's really not what it means to me. It's overall what does it mean in America as we are today. And let me just say, freedom has 2 different aspects. The way the Republican, and like you just stated before, the billionaires, the way they think about it, and the way Democrats think about it. The way the Republicans or those guys think about it is rooted in manifest destiny. That is, It's rooted in the ideology that this country was made at the behest for white people. And that's the problem. If you look at all the other things that you enunciated earlier, it's all rooted in manifest destiny, that ideology. I can bring a gun in here because this is my country. I can storm the Capitol, and I don't expect the cops to do anything because, after all, this country is built for white people. That is their freedom. Now, here's on the converse side of that. Here is the Democratic problem, and this is where the Democrats are kind of losing the narrative. The Democrats' freedom means that I'm going to give you everything, and I'm not going to require you to give anything in return. Let's remember what JFK said. Ask not what the country can do for you, but what you can do for the country. That ideology is being diffused by the current Democrat Party. They think that they can just
Lawrence, there's no such thing as a Democrat Party. Joe McCarthy was propagating that back in the 50s. He said, don't ever call it the Democratic Party, which is its real name. It sounds too nice. Call it the Democrat Party. And by the way, Democrats are not saying that Americans don't have obligations, social obligations. Democrats aren't saying Americans shouldn't be voting and participating in politics. Democrats aren't saying that Americans shouldn't hold up their responsibility as citizens of America. In fact, I'd say the opposite. The Democratic Party and Democratic politicians and Democrats like me are saying that we do have an obligation. I end my show every day with that. Get out there, get active, tag, you're it. Nobody is suggesting that except right-wingers, particularly on right-wing talk radio, who constantly say, well, the Democrat Party just wants a handout. They just would just like to take all the tax dollars and put it in their pocket, which is BS. We know that. History shows that.
That's true. I'm certainly not saying that either. I'm not saying that like the Republicans' philosophy that we just want handouts. No. I'm saying like Bill Clinton put in the welfare to work program, we need to have stuff like that where I'll be glad, and I use my tax money, hey, I'll be glad to give you anything you want to, but I want you in return to be able to say, hey, look, thanks for this, thanks for helping me. I'm on my feet now.
It does not need to be transactional, Lawrence. That Republican talking point that Bill Clinton picked up and the whole welfare to work thing, that was a punitive program. That was a way of means testing welfare programs and trying to use them to force people into the workplace. And why are people not going into the workplace? Because many of the jobs that are being offered pay so little that you can't have a decent life working at them, and you end up in grinding poverty and a constant cycle of just barely getting by and constantly being in debt. Instead of having a nanny state government say, yes, I'll give you a little welfare, but you've got to fill out a form every single week and tell me how you're doing, which is the Republican idea that Bill Clinton adopted. Instead, what we should be doing is establishing a fair economic structure and requiring employers to pay a decent wage. You will not be able to stop people from going to work if they have good opportunities and the job pays well.
You're listening to the Thom Hartmann Program. Call 202-808-9925.
We got to be careful about these right-wing memes. They are so infectious and they sound so good until you just look at them carefully and realize that they're just BS.
Threshold, the progressive plan to pull America back from the brink by Thom Hartmann. And this is from Chapter 2, The Economy. The epigraph Woody Guthrie's saying, some men rob you with a six-gun, others rob you with a fountain pen. The title, the opening part of this chapter, The Coup of the Elites. The election of 1992 pitted Bill Clinton against George H.W. Bush. While Bush was running as a conservative who was compassionate enough to hope for 1,000 points of privatized non-governmental light, Clinton campaigned as an unabashed FDR, believing in government as a solution liberal. In language reminiscent of Teddy Roosevelt's Progressive Square Deal and FDR's Progressive New Deal, Clinton proposed a new covenant between the U.S. government and U.S. citizens. In a speech at Georgetown University on October 23, 1991, he declared, "We've got to rebuild our political life before the demagogues and the racists and those who pander to the worst in us bring this country down. People once looked at the president and the Congress to bring us together, to solve problems, to make progress. Now, in the face of massive challenges, our government stands discredited, our people are disillusioned. There's a hole in our politics where our sense of common purpose used to be. To turn America around, we've got to have a new approach, founded on our most sacred principles as a nation, with a vision for the future. We need a new covenant, a solemn agreement between the people and their government to provide opportunity for everybody, inspire responsibility throughout our society, and restore a sense of community to our great nation. A new covenant to take government back from the powerful interests in the bureaucracy and give it back to the ordinary people of our country." More than 200 years ago, our founding fathers outlined our first social compact between government and the people, not just between lords and kings. More than 100 years ago, Abraham Lincoln gave his life to maintain the union that compact created. More than 60 years ago, Franklin Roosevelt renewed that promise with a New Deal that offered opportunity in return for hard work. Today, we need to forge a new covenant that will repair the damaged bond between the people and their government, restore our basic values, embed the idea that a country has the responsibility to help people get ahead, but that the citizens have not only the right, but the responsibility to rise as far and fast as their talents and determination can take them. And most important of all, that we're all in this together. We have to make good on the words of Thomas Jefferson, who once said, "A debt of service is due from every man to his country, proportional to the bounties which nature and fortune have measured to him." End of quote from Bill Clinton. Americans loved it. A majority of voters in 1992 were old enough to remember what America was like under the 1940 to 1981 New Deal era, when a single worker with a good job had health care, a pension, and could raise a family and buy a home. When the GI Bill educated millions. When hospitals and health insurance companies in nearly every state were required by law to be not-for-profit corporations, and health care was inexpensive and widely available. And they noticed that the 12 years of Reagan and Bush had begun the process of shattering that historic era, that the middle class was slipping away, the government had become remote and hostile rather than protecting the rights of workers and the middle class. Americans elected Clinton based on his FDR-style rhetoric. They were looking forward to a return to the golden age of America's middle class. They were ready for the new covenant, and apparently so was Bill Clinton. There is every sign that he actually believed his own rhetoric. On all this, he won the election in November and spent that month and December preparing his new covenant programs to restore the American middle class. Until January. As Adam Curtis brilliantly points out in a special documentary series he did for the BBC titled The Trap, a few weeks before Bill Clinton was to be sworn into office as President of the United States, he was visited by Goldman Sachs CEO Robert Rubin, who had just taken a $40 million paycheck for his last year with Goldman and would soon become the head of Clinton's economic team tasked with carrying out the new covenant, and with Alan Greenspan. Rubin and Greenspan sat the young new president down and told him the facts of life as they saw them. Clinton would not govern as an FDR liberal. Instead, he must cut government, promote free trade, and reduce regulation of business. Clinton complied and has been richly rewarded. In his second inaugural address, he declared, "The era of big government is over." The philosophy represented by Rubin and Greenspan doesn't believe in government as a solution to much of anything other than wars and crime. As true classical conservatives in the mold of Sir Edmund Burke and Thomas Hobbes, many modern libertarians and neoliberals don't even believe in democracy. As any libertarian will honestly admit, they call it the tyranny of the majority, or mob rule. Instead, because they believe in the inherently evil nature of most humans, they held that a small ruling elite of good people, the wise ones, must concentrate wealth and power, the first fuels the second by and large, in a small number of hands, out of the reach of what the first American conservative President John Adams called the rabble, us. They believed that social stability was more important than social mobility. As of this writing, the surest way to become wealthy in the United States or Britain is to be born to wealthy parents. The surest way to be poor is to be born to poor parents. Social mobility, the ability to move between classes for better or worse, has been rolled back from its highly fluid levels in the 1940 to 1980 years to a rigidity last measured in the 1920s as America was sliding into the Republican Great Depression. Conservatives, since Sir Edmund Burke's opposition to the Revolutionary War of 1776 to today's opponents of labor rights, believe that too much power and wealth in the hands of the middle class will inevitably lead to instability. The book,
On the Science Revolution this week is Dr. Michael Mann on the new climate war. He shares how fossil fuel companies have waged a 30-year campaign to deflect blame and responsibility and delay action on climate change. Dr. Eric Feigelding drops by, warning us the coronavirus could be a thermonuclear pandemic. He'll also talk about the new COVID variants and what he would do differently. Severine Fleming from Greenhorns is here about food security, regenerative agriculture, and the hidden value of local food. Tune into the Science Revolution wherever fine podcasts are available. Welcome back. Thom Hartmann here with you. Today is the day, by the way, the official publication date for my new book, The Hidden History of American Oligarchy, Reclaiming Our Democracy from the Ruling Class. And it's got a great quote from Daniel Ellsberg. I don't have the final copy of the book. I'll get one today in the mail from Amazon, I'm guessing, but or Powell's. I ordered one from each, but I don't know if you'd think my publisher would have sent me one, but so I don't have that quote right in front of me. But Daniel Ellsberg he said something to the effect of, "I learned something on every page," which was like, whoa, talk about high praise. But that book talks also about this issue of what is freedom. The billionaires have been trying to sell us now for 40 years, since Reagan, have been trying to sell us this idea that freedom means that the government doesn't do anything to support you. It doesn't create a foundation. If you wanted to use an analogy, it would be like saying freedom would be if the NFL just took the referees off the field. We're not going, the rules, We'll do away with half those regulations, those NFL regulations. That thing about not being able to grab people's face masks, that's a regulation that just kind of inhibits the free behavior of players, right? That thing about you can't punch somebody in the stomach with your fist during a football game, as you're running by them. These regulations just inhibit, good football players. So, we've got to do away with these regulations. Whichever team has the most money, they can have more players if they want. You can have an extra 2 or 3 guys on the field if you want. No problem. Can you imagine a football game where that was the case? Nobody would want to watch it. It wouldn't be fair. It wouldn't be fun to watch. You'd have no real competition. And yet that's how they've rigged our economy, and that's how they've rigged our political system. And you've got politicians who are dancing to the tune of billionaires. In some cases, like Joe Manchin, local billionaires. In other cases, national billionaires. You got, like Kirsten Sinema, you've got politicians who are dancing to the tune of billionaires saying, no. Freedom means that the billionaires get to do whatever they want, and they get their own tax rate, and they even have their own separate prison system. They call them country club prisons. That's for billionaires. And for everybody else, that's what Parchman's for. You got a crappy prison down there in Louisiana. That's for, you average folks. You got a different criminal justice system, essentially. You've got different lawyers. You can't afford the real lawyers. You get different jobs. You get to pay, $7.25 an hour. Suck it up, buddy. This is amazing. Kenyatta in Los Angeles. Hey, Kenyatta. Freedom?
Yeah, Tom, it's, I guess, fortuitous that you're on this topic this morning, because I just finished and was published this morning a piece over at Op-Ed News, and it's entitled very simply, .com, by the way. It's entitled Black Americans with a question mark. And I think before we, get into talking about freedom, if freedom is something that's assigned to Americans, then we have to ask ourselves the question: who's an American? Who qualifies as being an American? And you and I had a conversation about 4 years ago about this, and it garnered a very lively discussion. And the question remains: who is an American? And if Black people specifically are Americans, they are unlike any other group of Americans, because they're the only ones forced to come here. So before we talk about the secondary thing of freedom, we have to first ask ourselves, who's an American if freedom is something assigned to Americans? And let me say this. The word freedom, I have found, and I'm a bit of a word nerd, seems to be a European concept. You constantly see this word freedom in terms of societies that are dominated by Europeans. Free means without charge. So it's a very intricate kind of thing, and I don't think there's a real simple answer to it. So that's really kind of my take on freedom. I'm not sure as to what it means, because I don't know who it's assigned to. Am I making sense?
You are. And when we look at the structure of institutional racism, which is still very much alive and well, the freedom of people of color, African Americans, and the whole spectrum, but in particular African Americans in this country, who have been the particular victims of the doctrine of discovery and white supremacy and all this other stuff, Native Americans as well. But the oppression continues. Freedom, there's a lot of nuance to that conversation. But absolutely. I think that if we can achieve, and we now have an administration that's actually working toward this, and our first black vice president, et cetera, if we can achieve a society where we all agree that freedom, at the very least, means that if you get sick, you're not going to go bankrupt and your kids aren't going to be homeless, that if you lose your job, your kids aren't going to go to sleep hungry, that if you or your children are able to raise yourselves in this world through education, that education should be available to you and perhaps even subsidized. In Denmark, they pay you $400 a month to go to college or trade school. If we can agree on that foundational stuff and just start lifting people up, then and I think we also have to have a side conversation about what we, white America, and I'm speaking for myself here, what white Americans owe black Americans who built the U.S. Capitol, who built the White House. I mean, literally by hand, built it with no pay at all. All the profit and benefit of America. We need to correct the inequalities of the past at the same time that we're working to establish a foundation, a standing spot for all working class Americans that gives them access to the stuff that allows life to be what we would call free. I'd say that's the American dream. Is that a reasonable definition, Kenyatta?
I think it is, and I honor that, and I honestly, Tom, it was over 60 years ago or close to it. Martin Luther King, and I'm paraphrasing, said that we've come to the Capitol to cash a check. Yep. And the United States has given the Negro people a check, and it has come back with insufficient funds. He said that over half a century ago, and unfortunately, it is still the case. So yes, I just don't know that the imprint and the long legacy, 400 years is a lot of ground to cover, Tom. I just don't, I hope, that it can be done, but it's going to require a great deal of effort.
It's going to take a generation, Kenyatta, but to really wring this thing out. But we all need to start right now, right? And arguably, Lyndon Johnson started in a big way, and with Martin Luther King's encouragement, shall we say, back in the '60s. Harry Truman, integrating the Army. I mean, there have been a lot of steps along the way. We're moving in the right direction, I think, but nowhere near fast enough. Kenyatta, I've got to move along. Thank you so much for the call. It's great to hear from you, and I hope people check out your piece over at opednews.com. Terry in Marion Station, Maryland. Hey, Terry, what's on your mind?
Hi, Tom. Thanks for taking my call. I think freedom to me is the ideology I grew up with about democracy. Even though I understood how unfair many things were, I always saw it as an evolutionary process, that it was a long game, but it was going in the right direction, and that fairness and justice and laws were slowly getting better. And I think the hardest part that I felt in the last couple of years is that you start to see that being eroded in every level. Not that it wasn't there before, but it's so much more now, from truth to even having a conversation. And I think it's really that evolutionary process that I believed in, that it was going to take a while, but we were going in the right direction. And I think freedom to me is having that ideology and going in that right direction again.
Yeah. The arc of justice, bends toward, or the arc of history bends toward justice, but it's, as Kenyatta was saying, it bends slowly. So you would say that the right to vote, for example, is a piece of freedom. Right, the right to have some determination over our representation. I would add to that the right to elect representatives who are not owned by billionaires or giant corporations. Is a dimension of freedom. Yeah, and sadly, right now, so many of the options we're given are, which billionaire-supported politician do you want? And, it's unfortunate, and as a consequence of that, you end up with situations like Kyrsten Sinema and Joe Manchin and the entire Republican Party. But, step by step we'll get there. Terry, thanks so much for the call. You said it very, very well. 45 minutes past the hour. We'll continue this conversation to the top of the hour. And then next hour, Craig Unger is going to be with us with his new book. Stick around. We'll be right back.
You're listening to Thom Hartmann. Visit thomhartmann.com for audio and video archives.
This afternoon, I will be in conversation with my dear friend David Korten at Powell's Books. You can join in. It's over at powells.com. And welcome back, Les in Tacoma, Washington. Hey, Les, what's up?
Hey, how you doing, Tom?
Good.
Hey, freedom to me means...
Les, you need to hold the microphone right up to your mouth.
Okay, I got the microphone right up to my mouth, sir.
Perfect.
Freedom to me means to be liberated from the fallacies of whiteness. Everything you claim about right-wingers and their claims about losing their freedoms can be associated with neoliberals and white Democrats that support law and order and the plutocracy you protect every time I listen to your show. For all the years I've listened, the constant espousing of hope and getting out in the streets to do work. You just talked over a black man to espouse the privilege of your position and dominate a conversation you initiated. When he called to tell you what freedom means to him, that's the mental illness of white supremacy for the protection of whiteness. I've spoken of a few times. Before you cut me off and talk over me with your book promotion, please recognize your position and respect what we black folks attempt to communicate with you. Thank you for the opportunity.
You're welcome, Les. Thank you very much for your call. David in Los Angeles, you're on the air.
Well, Tom, this is a very heavy topic. What is freedom? And so, but I would submit to us, to your audience and to yourself, Tom, at this stage of the reality that we find ourselves in today, I would submit the freedom from deception. And to highlight that point would be the conversation you had with the person who takes on these right-wing memes. Right? Now, he sounded good up to a point, just like the fellow who just got off the phone. Right? But the deception have been so entrenched and so integrated into the education and the psyche of us as a people, right? Now, of course, you know, because you're a historian. Now, going back to this, the big buck and our welfare queens, as you adequately pointed out about the means of the Reagan era, right, where this stuff originated from. Right?
Yeah, just a heads up, David. We're going to hit a break in about 30 seconds, so go ahead.
So, but my point is simply this. As you hone in on the talking points, right, and these memes about pulling yourself up by your bootstrap and being very callous in regards to your empathy towards those who are less fortunate is the order of the day, right? And so I would submit to you, Tom, is that the freedom from deception or being propagandized. And I would say this in closing, Tom, that I would hate to be a white person because the deception and the propaganda that is leveled against you guys is like off the chain, right? So, but anyhow,
I think it's deserved. Respectfully, David, I think the attacks on whiteness and white supremacy, I mean, that has been the organizing principle of this country for 400 years. I think that's deserved. But thank you. Thank you for everything you said. We'll be right back. Hey, my new book is out. The Hidden History of American Oligarchy, Reclaiming Our Democracy from the Ruling Class. Want to know more? The links are all over at thomhartmann.com. In our special video over at thomhartmann.com for supporters of our program, the one today is for anybody who has any connection, or for this week, anybody who has any connection with the military or anybody in the military who might still think that Donald Trump is a good guy. And I'm going through, like, I don't know how many, 20, 30, 40, 50 individual data points of times when Trump has trashed our troops, when Trump has deported troops, when Trump has deported military spouses who aren't citizens, when Trump has lied to our troops, when Trump has, specifically pulled money from our troops. I mean, he took money out of military housing, which is in some parts of the country, mold infested and really in a crisis, to build his border wall that Mexico is supposed to pay for. As just one example. So there's a whole list of these things in that new video that's available over at thomhartmann.com, especially for anybody you know who has any consideration or concern at all for our U.S. military. Welcome back. Michelle in Denver. Hey, Michelle, what's up?
Freedom is not allowing people to die from COVID. Freedom.
Amen.
I lost my aunt yesterday. I lost her.
I'm
my
so sorry,
sister-in-law, she didn't even have time. She had no time. 2 hours. She went into the hospital and she's gone. I don't understand how people can be 72 million people voted to continue this. And we're paying a heavy price. This country was never built on people being equal, never. And I don't know how we're going to survive this because I'm not forgiving them. I'm not. This is beyond irreprehensible what's happening to people. We're losing our livelihoods. We're losing our homes. We're losing our jobs. People are barely hanging on right now. And people said, this is okay. Forgive them. Move on. How do you move on? You can't. It's hard. When this is preventable, all of it was preventable. He needs to be in prison. The Republican Party needs to go with him. Mitch McConnell, how can we have him in elected? Lindsey Graham, they all sat by and watched this. They watch American citizens die, and people of color are getting hit the hardest. And I'm a black woman who just lost somebody and who's now a statistic in that. I don't know how they expect us to move forward like this. How? And some black people voted, too, against their best interests. How do you do that? I see homeless every day, and it breaks my heart. I don't have $1 million to give them. I can only give them what I have. And entire families in shelters and in food lines. We gotta change, and we gotta help these people. I don't care about working with them anymore. I just want to get people help and medicine.
Amen. Michelle, I'm so sorry.
Come together, Jesus Christ. How do we do this? How can we do this to each other? For $1, for their tax cuts, 400,000 people have died for tax cuts. And the rich to keep getting rich. Americans tell me I gotta work 50 hours a week. I don't know if we're gonna make it through this. I don't know if I am. And that's just an honesty. And I grieve for the other families and those who have lost everything, their businesses, their homes. They can't find a job. This country has to change, and we have to force it to change now. Conversation over. Game over, period. We got to get the rest of the Republican Party out. There's no way none of them should be in office, not doing what they've done to the American people.
I agree.
And I just want to say thank you for all you do, Tom, because you keep me sane along with other people. I have that helped us fight to get Joe Biden in and get Warnock and the Democrats in office, because we've been fighting for a long time and we need peace too. We need to find a way to bring back balance and equality and justice, and it be a fair, level playing game, and not allow people like Trump ever to be in office again, because he's destroying families. And I've lost friends over this. I can't speak to them now.
Would you like to speak we have about 45 seconds until we're going to hit the end of this hour. Would you like to speak briefly about your aunt who you lost?
She was a good person. She got COVID from feeding children in school who had no meals. They had no food. She gave the shirt off her back to people. She had just met the love of her life, and they've only been married 2 years, so he's lost a person he couldn't even spend time with. And there's a family in Mississippi suffering, a beautiful family, a big, huge family that have now lost one of their patriarchs who helped keep the family together and who cared about everybody and was willing to risk her life to feed children because they had no meals, to do right in the community. And that's what's important here is people value human beings. Not money,
Michelle,
not a house, not a car.
Michelle, thank you so much. I'm sorry we're out of time, but you speak so well for so many. I know so many Americans are in so much pain right now. And thank you for expressing it so brilliantly. We'll be right back.
You're listening to Thom Hartmann.
Support the Thom Hartmann Program. They are CB Distillery, CBD for sleeping. More info at cbdistillery.com, code TOM. The Clean Phone Pro, phone sanitizer and charger. More info at thenewdealshop.com. Plexiderm, real science, real results. More info at plexiderm.com, code TOM. ExpressVPN, the VPN that just works. More information at expressvpn.com/Tom. Gabby takes the pain out of insurance shopping. More info at gabby.com/Tom. HelloFresh, the #1 meal kit delivery service. More info at hellofresh.com, code TOM. And Superbeats, heart chews for heart-healthy energy. More info at superbeatsradio.com/Tom.
Our book today is Jailbreak Out of History by Butch Lee. This is from the first chapter, Jailbreak Out of History, Harriet. Focus on Amazons, about why we deal with real women as myths, girls who never really existed. Yet and again, all are around us, and that we can't bring ourselves to see. Because seeing through white men's eyes is about non-vision of ourselves. So let's deal with a real Amazon. Think about Harriet Tubman. Take 6 months. In fact, take a year and think. Break it on down. What does it mean to be the most famous new African woman in U.S. history? What does it mean to be stuck in that lie? What's the meaning of being famous while being hidden and disfigured and dissed? Let's jailbreak Harriet Tubman out of white history and place her in Amazon and New African, her story, her people's story. Harriet Tubman's life is a live weapon placed in our minds, showing us what it means to be an Amazon, which is why the capitalist patriarchy has forbidden us to touch on it for so long. In this, maybe for the first time, we can see Amazons as a future force in a clash of peoples and nations, not as myths, but as players in the whole difficult course of world politics. We can also appreciate the bittersweet tang of reality as the peeling away of layers of propaganda and disfigurement which have hidden Harriet from us exposes how much we assume and how little we have known. New African women have already pointed out the significant pattern of Harriet's exclusion. Cultural critic Bell Hooks said recently, if we could recover Ida B. Wells and Harriet Tubman to the extent that we've recovered, say, Zora Neale Hurston, I think that's an important contrast because people want to bury that revolutionary black female history. Historian Deborah Gray White connects Harriet's treatment to a larger pattern in the mainstream history of slavery, in which black women, quote, were reduced to insignificance and largely ignored, end quote. In examining the influential historian Stanley Elkins, she points out, quote, that Elkins seems to omit women altogether was accentuated by his description of slaves whom he identified as part of an American underground, those who never succumbed to Samboism. Among those mentioned were Gabriel, who led the revolt of 1820, Denmark Vesey, leading spirit of the 1822 plot at Charleston, and Nat Turner, an omission conspicuous by its absence, was Harriet Tubman. If Elkins had really been thinking of slaves of both sexes, he would hardly have forgotten this woman, who became widely known as the Moses of her people, end of quote. Patriarchal capitalisms, which only want Amazons to be exotic myths about forgotten ages, have hidden Harriet Tubman in her own fame. They both trivialize and exceptionalize her. These are tools of oppressor culture. The stripped down and censored version of her life is told in elementary schools all over the U.S. empire. So much so that everyone thinks they know her story already, although they don't. Harriet Tubman was born in slavery in Maryland around 1820. She escaped to the North when she was 29, but kept returning secretly to the South again and again to help other slaves escape. For this, she became known as Moses. True statements. But by limiting her, it becomes clever propaganda against her and against her people. Where patriarchy has been unable to deny that women do significant things, it denies the full meaning of what we do by trivializing them. Mary Daly, feminist philosopher, traces the enormity of what patriarchy has done to us. In ancient Greece, the goddess Hecate, also known as Artemis and Diana, was sometimes known as Trivia and represented by a three-faced statue. That was also the name used for the intersection of three paths, which in many old cultures were the sites of mystical power. She writes in Gynecology, quote, in light of the cosmic significance of the term trivia as the crossing of the three roads and of the goddess who bears this name, contemporary meaning of the term in English should be examined. The English term, which according to Merriam-Webster is derived from the Latin trivium or crossroads, is defined as common, ordinary, commonplace, of little worth or importance, insignificant, flimsy, minor, or slight. Of course, according to patriarchal values, that which is commonplace is of little worth. For in a competitive hierarchical society, scarcity is intrinsic to worth. Thus, gold is more important than fresh air, and consequently, we are forced to live in a world in which gold is easier to find than pure air. End quote. So to trivialize Harriet Tubman, the capitalist patriarchy pictures her as an idealized woman by their definition, who makes a life of helping others. Thus, her deeds are squeezed into women's assigned maternal role as nurturer, helper, and rescuer of men, who then go on to do important things. But Harriet wasn't repping Mother Teresa. She wasn't even any kind of civilian at all. She was a combatant, a guerrilla,
a warrior carrying pistol and rifle, fighting in her people's long war for freedom, a war that rocked the foundations of American society, and that has never gone away. Think about what it means to be called Moses, which was the code name other new Africans gave her, and which became Harriet's famous warrior name in the anti-slavery underground. When we check out the Bible, we can see that Moses was a ruthless visionary, someone who forced the boldest changes and risks upon his people so that they could survive, who led them out of captivity. To put it simply, Moses was a leader in a time of war. So too was Harriet Tubman. The book, Jailbreak Out of History by Butch Lee.
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
Welcome back. Thom Hartmann here with you. I want to do a deep dive into a new book that I find absolutely fascinating. Craig Unger is the author of 5 books on the Republican war on democracy. His latest is American KOMPROMAT. He's a Vanity Fair contributor for the past 15 years. His Twitter handle is Craig Unger, CraigUnger. And the book is absolutely extraordinary. Craig, welcome back to the program. It's been a while since we've talked.
Thanks for having me, Tom.
It's absolutely my pleasure. I've had people call into this program and echo a question that has occurred to me on more than one occasion. For the last 4 years, we had a president who dismantled large parts of the American government, who tried to put toadies into the American justice system who would overlook the crimes of foreign dictators, and not just any one country, multiple foreign dictators, including, for example, Saudi Arabia covering up the Khashoggi murder, stuff like that. In fact, Jared Kushner said, we've got this under control. Who has pursued a policy with regard to a pandemic against medical advice, against the advice of wise advisors, that has caused now America to have the worst case of COVID in the world. We are 4% of the world's population. We have 20% of the world's deaths and cases. And people call in and they say, is he doing this because he's stupid? Is he doing this because he's incompetent? Is he doing it just because some American billionaires want this kind of thing? Or is he doing it because a foreign government said, we don't like America and we want you to take it down? What are your thoughts on that question, Craig, and how does it interface with your book, American KOMPROMAT?
Right. Well, we've heard the question asked many different ways, and one of the questions is, what does Vladimir Putin have on him? Why is he doing everything to please Putin? Putin wanted to destroy the idea that American democracy was real. He said it was corrupt. And now over 70 million Americans, the followers of Donald Trump, actually seem to believe that. I mean, it's absolutely extraordinary. So I went back and tried to answer the question. And one thing I realized is almost nobody had bothered to ask former members of the KGB, the feared Soviet spy agency. And I had extended interviews, really dozens and dozens of hours, with a man named Yuri Shvets, who was a major in the KGB in the 1980s. He was stationed in Washington, D.C., and his colleagues in the New York station, the New York Residentura of the KGB, were recruiting Donald Trump as an asset. And I went step by step, and I think it's the first detailed narrative of how this happened.
Well, we have an hour here. Let's just walk through it. This starts in 1977. Tell me about that.
Right. Well, Trump at the time had just married his first wife, Ivana, who was a Czech national. And the Czech Secret Service, which is known as the STB, reported to the KGB. This was the years of the evil empire of the Soviet Union. The Cold War was raging. And so they began to keep tabs on Donald Trump that way. And that became important. We're not sure exactly how far that frame developed, but we do know they reported it on Trump to the KGB. My story starts out a little later that I do talk about the Czech Secret Service, but the real story starts a little later, around 1980. And at that time, Trump had developed his first really genuinely successful, and many of them were not really successful, real estate ventures. And it was a Grand Hyatt Hotel, which is right next to Grand Central Station. And like any hotel, it opened around 1980. And like any hotel, it needed a lot of television sets. And where did Trump buy his TV sets but an electronics store on Lower Fifth Avenue near the Flatiron Building, if you're familiar with New York.
And you're talking about. Hang on just a second, Craig. You kind of flew through that, and I think a lot of people might have missed what you're saying. He built a hotel. It's got hundreds and hundreds of rooms in it. I've stayed in that hotel. I've taught seminars in that hotel, in fact, and each one of those rooms has a television in it. So he needed hundreds and hundreds of televisions. So where did he go to get those? Go ahead.
Right. You might think that a blue chip franchise outfit like Hyatt would go to a reliable third party vendor. But instead, they went to a place called Joy Ludd Electronics on Lower Fifth Avenue. And Trump bought hundreds of TV sets there. And it happens that electronics store was controlled by the KGB. It was sort of a KGB front. And that's the man, one of the co-owners, was known as, according to my source, was known as a spotter agent. And what does a spotter agent do? He spots potential recruits for the KGB. And when this transaction took place, for the very first time, the doors of the KGB were opened to Donald Trump.
Well, hang on just a second. How do you know that Donald Trump didn't patronize this particular store simply because, some person 3 or 4 levels down inside his organization did a search on those TVs that they needed in New York City and found that store was offering the lowest price?
Well, they may well have been offering the lowest price, and it may well be that Trump really didn't know what he was doing. That's quite possible. But the KGB did know what it was doing. And according to my sources, the owner was a Ukrainian Jew. When he left the Soviet Union in 1972, it was virtually impossible for Soviet Jews to get out of the Soviet Union. And the KGB made a deal with him, and it did with many people. And they said, well, we'll let you emigrate on one condition, and that is you have to work for the KGB when you're in the United States. And later on, that's exactly what happened. The store was, the FBI was keeping an eye on it. I talked to a former federal prosecutor who said he hung out with the FBI watching the comings and goings of it. And this was a way to first make contact with Donald Trump. He was one of hundreds of people. This was not one great, huge 40-year plan. This took place over 40 years. Rather, it was a sequence of operations that developed and developed and developed. And this is how, at least this part of the intelligence began.
So how did they make contact with Donald Trump? I mean, I'm still operating the assumption here that it wasn't Trump who walked into the store and bought the TVs. How did they get to him?
Right. It was the owner, Semyon Kislin. I confirmed it with him. He confirmed it by email. Originally, he had told Bloomberg News that he sold hundreds of TVs to Trump. So that much had been out there. What is new here is his alleged contact, his relationship with the KGB, and the store's relationship with the KGB. And this is from my source, Yuri Spitz, who is, to my knowledge, the first KGB operative, the first former operative of the KGB, rather, to come out in public and to explain exactly how it happened and how how this operation went forward, and that they gradually reeled Trump in. He may not have done this knowingly initially, but this was the start of it.
That's fascinating. We're talking with Craig Unger, his brand new book, just out, American KOMPROMAT, How the KGB Cultivated Donald Trump as an Asset. Did we have a foreign asset as president for 4 years? We're going to find out. Craig Unger is with us. You can check out his book wherever fine books are sold, American KOMPROMAT.
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
We'll be back with Craig in just a moment. Stick around. And welcome back. We're talking with Craig Unger. Craig, I'm wary of reporting that is, the 6 degrees of separation from Kevin Bacon kind of thing, that somebody knew somebody who knew somebody, and therefore, how did the KGB reach out to Donald Trump in 1980 when his hotel bought a bunch of TVs from this KBG front store? How did that happen?
Well, Semyon Kislin confirmed this to me in an email. He would not go into details, whether it was by telephone or whatever. So I don't know all the answers to that. But that is also that the transaction itself had been first reported by Bloomberg News. What is new here is Kislin's relationship to the KGB. And by the way, my source on this has come forward in public, he's said this quite publicly. So once the doors are open, they began to assess whether Trump is worthwhile to recruit. That is, at the time, Trump was a businessman who wasn't even nationally famous. He was famous in New York at that time, I think, for the Grand Hyatt. But he was certainly not known internationally. And the KGB, in addition, he had no access to classified information, but the KGB often recruited influential businessmen. A case in point is the late Armand Hammer, who ran Occidental Petroleum. And he had these very lucrative concessions with the Soviet Union, and he was what they called a special unofficial contact. That is, it's different from being a Soviet agent. If you were an agent, that meant you could be tasked with very specific operations, and you'd have to report on that.
Is that what you call a useful idiot?
Well, I mean, that goes farther down the road. It's very, very hard to discern what is in Trump's mind at any point. I mean, at a certain point, he'd have to be pretty idiotic not to know he's doing all these favors to the Soviet Union.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So they reached out to him in 1980, and how did Trump respond to that? Do we have any record of that?
We do not have a record of that. I think he thought he got a good deal on the TV sets and so forth. But what happened next is that other people in the Soviet, with the KGB, started reaching out to him and assessing whether it was worthwhile expending resources on him to develop him. And that happened, and it led up to his being invited by the KGB to the Soviet Union in 1987. Mm-hmm. And you can see some of this.
Go ahead.
No, you can see some of this develop in the newspaper clips during this time. Trump was sort of a party animal back in these years. In 1987, he met Jeffrey Epstein. They had parties where they had 28 girls and 2 guys. He was fashioning himself as a latter-day version of Hugh Hefner. And but if you look at the newspaper clips from that era, in the Washington Post and in the New York Times, Trump is starting to present himself as an expert on nuclear weapons. He says that he should be running the nuclear arms limitations talk for Ronald Reagan at the time.
We'll get to that in just on the other side of this break. Craig Unger is with us. His new book, American KOMPROMAT. Hey, my new book is out, The Hidden History of American Oligarchy, Reclaiming Our Democracy from the Ruling Class. Want to know more? The links are all over at thomhartmann.com. We have a new video up over at thomhartmann.com about conspiracy theories. Abby Richards came up with a kind of a hierarchy of conspiracies, maybe a variation on the old Maslow hierarchy. And it goes from actual conspiracies to maybe this was a conspiracy, maybe not, we have questions, to this is kind of crazy stuff, but who knows, flying saucers, for example, to actual science denial, conspiracy theories that actually serve to promote the interests of a particular industry or wealthy individuals, to the totally crazy stuff, the flat earth, the reptilian overlords and all that kind of thing, conspiracy theories that can do tremendous damage. And, one of those being one of the conspiracy theories that, brought two Republicans into Congress this year. So anyhow, I lay the whole thing out with a new video for our supporters over at thomhartmann.com. Craig Unger, the author of American KOMPROMAT. So, Craig, 1977, Donald Trump marries Ivana Zelnikova, a 28-year-old Czech model, and the KGB starts watching him. In 1980, a front organization for them in New York sells him, presumably at a really, really good price, TVs for one of his major hotels, and kind of opens the door for a relationship between him and them. Which takes us to 1984 and to 1984, where David Bogatin, and then Trump starts talking about, I'm an expert on nuclear arms. How did Trump go from being in 1980 basically a guy who was representing himself as a playboy, as that generation's answer to Hugh Hefner? How does, with these parties with Jeffrey Epstein, with just the two of them and 20 young women, how does he go from that to publishing a piece in the New York Times and the Washington Post 4 years later, presenting himself as an expert on the nuclear arms relationship between the United States and the Soviet Union?
Right. See, if you go to the clips of the mid-'80s, that Trump is talking to reporters at the New York Times and Washington Post and saying that he's a world-leading expert on nuclear arms, which of course he's sore. But according to my source, Yuri Shvets, who was in the KGB at that point, and Yuri recruited spies for the Soviets back then. He was in the Washington bureau of the KGB, and all the stuff with Trump was going on in the New York. And you see them pumping him full of KGB talking points, saying that, wow, you have these wonderfully unorthodox views on foreign policy. You should really run for higher office. You should be president. You should make all these views public. Now, if Trump reaches out to report papers in the United States. And the next step is that he is invited to the Soviet Union, and the entire trip is overseen by the KGB. There's a general in the KGB named Ivan Gromyakov who initiates the invitation. It goes through the Soviet ambassador directly to Trump, and he's flown over by Intourist, which is really a subsidiary of the KGB. It's a travel agency, but it makes sure you are fully monitored the whole trip, that there are you're being monitored in your bedroom at the hotel once you get there, and so forth. And at the time, all the while, Trump, according to Yuri, is being force-fed talking points by the KGB, and that leads up to his exploratory run for the presidency. People have forgotten about this, but this is for the 1988 nomination.
Wow. And that was the end of Reagan's term, and that was when his vice president, George Herbert Walker Bush, got the Republican nomination. Was Trump planning on running as a Democrat or a Republican? And how serious did that get?
Yes, as a Republican. And it was reported in the New York Times, and Trump went up to Portsmouth, New Hampshire, to a restaurant called Yokin's, and that's sort of a rite of passage if you're running for the Republican nomination and you want to enter the primaries that year. And the Times did report on it. It's sort of buried and forgotten. But what is absolutely extraordinary is what happens next. And I think it's the closest to real evidence of this that's pretty solid. Again, this comes from Yuri Spitz, the major in the KGB. And what you see is in September of 1987, Trump takes out a full-page ad in the New York Times, the Washington Post, and the Boston Globe, and it's full of all these wacky talking points about American foreign policy. And it says America's being taken to the cleaners and that we should, we're being screwed over by NATO, and our allies like Japan are just not worth it. And these are, no American politician was talking like that at this time, or frankly, any time since. NATO has been a real bulwark for the rise of the Western alliance and our ties to Western markets in Europe, of course, and Japan as well. So why was he trying to demolish them? It's because the KGB wanted to. And Yuri, meanwhile, my source had gone back to Moscow, and he was in KGB headquarters in September of 1987, and the KGB circulated an internal memo celebrating the acquisition of a new asset by the KGB and a successful active measure that's an act of propaganda. And
that was Donald Trump publishing these pieces in the Washington Post and the New York Times calling for breaking up our relationship with NATO and Japan, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah, amazing stuff. We'll continue on the other side of this break. Craig Unger is with us. His new book out, American KOMPROMAT. Stick around.
You're listening to the Thom Hartmann Program. Call 202-808-9925.
We'll be right back with more of Craig Unger on his new book. Stick around.
For our book club today, we're reading Out of the Wreckage, A New Politics for an Age of Crisis by George Monbiot. This is from Chapter 3, Don't Look Back. The political history of the second half of the 20th century could be summarized as the conflict between its two great narratives, neoliberalism and social democracy. Social democracy in this era, whose story I briefly summarized in Chapter 1, acquired much of its power and coherence from the thinking of one remarkable man. Across 4 decades, John Maynard Keynes's work dominated economic thought and practice. During the period the French called the Trente Glorieuses, 1945 to 1975, his prescriptions are widely credited with reviving economies and distributing their benefits. That they remain more or less the only mainstream alternative to neoliberalism today reveals a remarkable stagnation of both thought and ambition. The first and most obvious problem with an attempt to use Keynesian social democracy as a core political narrative is that the story is more than 80 years old. Political stories need to be renewed. If politics does not feel fresh, it struggles to kindle the imaginative excitement from which hope arises. The second problem is that the surviving enthusiasm for Keynes among mainstream parties is highly selective. It has been reduced in most cases to lowering interest rates when economies are sluggish and engaging in tepid counter-cyclical public spending, which means injecting public money into the economy when unemployment is high or recession threatens. Other Keynesian measures, such as raising taxes when an economy grows quickly to dampen the boom-bust cycle, the fixed exchange rate system, capital controls, and a self-balancing global banking system, an international clearing union, all of which Keynes saw as essential complements to these policies, have been discarded and forgotten. Not only does this ensure that the rich old story has been reduced to 2 thin chapters, whose loss of context destroys their narrative power, But the absence of other Keynesian measures, as well as changed global circumstances, weakens the effectiveness of the remaining elements of policy. Let me give you an example. In 2009, in the hope of boosting the economy in the wake of the financial crash, the British government spent £300 million on stimulating sales of new cars. Under its scrappage scheme, if car owners traded in their old vehicles for new ones, the government, with the help of manufacturers, knocked £2,000 off the price. This lavish program was partly justified as an environmental measure, though it was clear from the outset that it would lead to a rise in environmental impacts as the materials and energies used in manufacturing new cars outweigh any likely savings from better fuel economy. Its primary purpose was to boost British car assembly plants and protect the jobs of their workers. But European state aid rules forbade such schemes from discriminating between cars made in Britain and cars made abroad. British car parts assembled only some 15% of the vehicles sold in that country, which meant that 85% of the benefit went to car plants in Germany, Japan, and other manufacturing nations. We could see this spending as foreign aid to some of the world's richest nations. The current pattern of globalization, which developed partly as a result of abandoning the fixed exchange rates and capital controls that Keynes advocated, ensures that this problem is to some extent repeated wherever Keynesian stimulus spending is applied. It might lead to a general, if scarcely detectable, global economic uplift, but the domestic impact will necessarily be weaker than Keynes intended. This issue is compounded by the phenomena of job-free growth, caused in part by the automation now spreading into almost every economic sector. Today, governments pull the starter cord, spending public money and cutting interest rates, that ignited the economy and employment in the past, only to discover that it snaps before the motor fires. Two feeble measures, removed from the rich framework of thought and narrative in which they were once embedded, have little chance of sustaining a political revival. Another issue is that the troubles that beset the Keynesian model in the 1970s have not disappeared. While the oil embargo of '73 was the immediate trigger for the lethal combination of high inflation and high unemployment, called stagflation back then, that Keynesian policies were almost powerless to counteract. Problems with the system had been mounting for years. Falling productivity and rising costs push inflation, wages and prices pursuing each other upwards, were already beginning to erode support for Keynesian economics. Most importantly, perhaps, the program had buckled in response to the political demands of capital. Strong financial regulations and controls on the movement of money began to weaken in the 1950s as governments started to liberalize financial markets. Richard Nixon's decision in '71 to suspend the convertibility of dollars into gold destroyed the system of fixed exchange rates on which much of the success of Keynes's policies depended. The capital controls introduced to prevent financiers and speculators from sucking money out of balanced Keynesian economies collapsed. Today, it's hard to find a mainstream politician in Europe or the Anglophone nations, including those who call themselves Keynesians, prepared to call for their reintroduction. We cannot hope that the strategies deployed by global finance that helped to destroy the efficacy of Keynes's measures in the '70s will be unlearned. If the soft Keynesianism proposed by opponents of neoliberalism is to amount to anything but tinkering, it has to confront a wider set of challenges than most of its advocates have yet been prepared to acknowledge. But perhaps the biggest problem residual Keynesianism confronts in the 21st century is that when it does work, it collides headfirst with the environmental crisis. The book, Out of the Wreckage by George Monbiot.
You can find an absolutely fascinating library of my writings, including my daily rants, over at thomhartmann.medium.com. Hey, my new book is out. The Hidden History of American Oligarchy, Reclaiming Our Democracy from the Ruling Class. In this book, I trace the history of the struggle against oligarchy from America's founding to the United States' war with the feudal Confederacy to President Franklin Roosevelt's struggle against economic royalists who wanted to block the New Deal. In each of those cases, the oligarchs lost the battle. But with increasing right-wing control, we're at a crisis point. Want to know more? You can sign up for 3 virtual book events. Powell's virtual event, In Conversation with David Korten, is Tuesday, February 2nd at 5 p.m. Pacific Time. The Seattle Town Hall virtual event is Thursday, February 4th at 6 p.m. Pacific Time. And the Books and Books virtual event in conversation with David Corden is Tuesday, February 9th at 4 p.m. Pacific Time. Come support your local bookstores and hear about my new book on oligarchy. The links are all over at thomhartmann.com. And welcome back. We're talking with Craig Unger, the author of multiple books, including his newest, American Compromat. And Craig, we kind of left the story off in 1987, as I recall, with the Soviet Union. Keep in mind, this is pre-Gorbachev, Glasnost and all this kind of stuff. With the Soviet Union actually essentially throwing a party that they've recruited a new agent in Donald Trump. Do I have that right, or am I exaggerating?
Well, there's Gorbachev has taken over by then, but it's before the real thaw. It really is. I mean, the Soviet Union crumbled in 1991, and this is several years earlier. And what you see is that Donald Trump has taken out a full-page ad in three of the nation's most prestigious newspapers that are putting forth KGB talking points. And the KGB actually circulates a memo, an internal memo, announcing that as a successful active measure done by their new asset, Donald Trump.
All right, and then he goes up to New Hampshire to explore a run for president. So bring us up to the Republican primary. What I'm assuming, it's been widely reported in the press that he's been doing a lot of business with oligarchs all over the world, but particularly from the former Soviet states and from Russia, and apparently laundering their money. Is that a part of this story?
Yes, it is. If you go back to 1984, you'll see a man named David Bogadin, who is another Soviet emigre, and Trump had just built Trump Tower, and it was glitzy, and everyone was oohing and eyeing over it. And this David Bogadin comes in. He has $5 million in cash. He meets personally with Donald Trump, and he says, "I'll take 5 condos." $5 million, by the way, back then is the equivalent of about $15 million today. So Trump doesn't ask any questions. He takes the money. And this is, in effect, money laundering. The two predicates for money laundering are all cash transactions with an anonymous enterprise. And Trump did this repeatedly, again and again and again. The state of New York Attorney General investigated a bit and said this was money laundering. And what's amazing to me is there were at least 1,300 similar cases, that is, Trump condos that were sold under similar conditions that could pass for money laundering. All cash, anonymous purchase.
1,300 times?
Yeah, I don't think that's an accident. I think that's a pattern.
So, this is why Eric Trump said we don't need a lot of money from American banks. We're getting all the money we need from Russia. Is that what he was talking about?
Well, that's certainly part of it, and it continues later on after Trump goes many, many times in Atlantic City, and a company called Bayrock, a real estate development company called, opens in Trump Tower, and they offer him fabulous deals. You don't have to put up a dime. You develop the buildings. We'll do all of that. We'll raise hundreds of millions of dollars, and we'll give you a very healthy piece of the action. We just want to use your name. And this is money that was coming from enterprises tied to the Russian mob and the KGB and its successors in the Russian Federation.
So we see that Trump was doing that. I mean, my understanding is that there were also Saudi billionaires who were buying into Trump Tower and buying Trump products, and there were billionaires from other countries who were laundering money for him too. Is this a matter of, at least at this stage in the game, here we're up to the presumably the early 2000s, late 90s, I think is when his bankruptcies were, that he is displaying some kind of loyalty to one particular country, to Russia, or just that any oligarch or any corrupt regime that comes along and says, hey, Donald, we can make you millions of dollars if you'll just launder money for us, he just jumps at. I mean, is this Donald Trump being a career criminal, or is this Donald Trump being a Russian asset?
Well, both. I mean, I don't think there's a real difference. I mean, I regard his temperament as that of a mobster, but the deals the Russian intelligence is very, very closely tied to Russian organized crime. It's not like the United States where you always see the Italian mafia at war with the FBI. Russian organized crime is part of Russian intelligence. They use it, and they're allowed to work as they work within the parameters of what was the KGB, its successors.
So
Trump will deal with
next step,
anyone, really, the Saudis, as you say, or other people as well.
Right. And in fact, I realize it's an aside to this. I don't know if you cover Jared Kushner getting $1 billion out of the Middle East while he's in the White House. I mean, isn't that the same sort of thing, exploiting a position to enrich yourself?
Absolutely. I think when we look at the pardons that came out a couple of weeks ago, we're going to unravel a lot of scandalous behavior. That is, people were pardoned because they took pardon deals and may have kicked back huge sums to Donald Trump and his family.
We're talking with Craig Unger, his new book, American Compromat. Craig, in some of your writings, and I know there's a chapter about it in your book, American Compromat, you talk about Donald Trump's relationship with Jeffrey Epstein. Is this related in any way to his relationship with Russian mobsters?
Well, there is a big overlap, I think. And, as I say, the title of the book is American Compromat. Compromat means compromising material. And when I look at Ghislaine Maxwell, most people have looked at sexual trafficking, which it is and was horrible. But I look at it more as a compromat factory. Is they are manufacturing recording the dirty little secrets of the richest and most powerful people in the world. They had video cameras in after another of Trump's. I'm sorry, there's an incoming there that I'm going to ignore. But so they had enormous amounts of compromise, and how it was used is absolutely fascinating, because you have to look at, well, who had control of this compromise? Clearly Epstein did to some extent before he was killed, but he was investigated by 2005. So the Palm Beach County Sheriff's Department had some of it. The lawyers on both sides had some of it. Ghislaine Maxwell had some of it. And I even tracked down a former sheriff from the Palm Beach County Sheriff's Department who told me he had 478 sex videos, DVDs, and he escaped to Russia. I tracked him down by phone in Moscow, and clearly he was trying to make deals with the Russian government, which appeared to be selling all that compromat to Russia.
Now, is this 478 sex videos of Donald Trump with underage girls at Jeffrey Epstein's place, or just all kinds of wealthy and powerful Americans that Jeffrey Epstein invited over to have sex with underage girls?
Well, it appears to be the latter, though there was one case, and an associate of Epstein told me that around 2004, Epstein and Trump had a big falling out. They'd been friends for around 15 years or so. And Epstein was with Trump, and he started showing around photos of Trump with, I believe, two half-naked girls, and I was told they were girls, not women. They were quite young, and they are Trump is in the photo, and they are pointing at and laughing a wet stain on Trump's trousers that are in an unfortunate location.
Meaning what? That he had just had sex?
Well, it
or that he's
appears
incontinent.
to have meant that, yes, and that. Well, I'm not going to go there. That, to be honest, that possibility had not occurred to me, but I guess it is though Trump appears to be smiling in the photo.
Well, his former producer over at Celebrity Apprentice says that he wears diapers. I mean, who knows?
Right. I don't know about that one.
Yeah, fascinating stuff. We're talking with Craig Unger, who's done a deep dive into many of the secrets of Donald Trump. Is he? Is he a Russian agent? Is he simply a useful idiot? Is he exploiting these? What's really going on here? We'll get right down to the nub of this in about 4 minutes. Stick around as we hit this break here. 45 minutes past the hour.
You're listening to Thom Hartmann. Visit ThomHartmann.com for audio and video archives.
Craig Unger's new book, American Compromat, right after this. And welcome back. So, Craig, where do we go from Jeffrey Epstein? Well, first of all, what in your mind, what is the significance of Trump's relationship with Epstein? It sounds like he was in a position where he was being blackmailed by multiple people, or at least was compromised and was vulnerable to blackmail from the Soviets, from Jeffrey Epstein. Were there others? I mean, he had been doing business with mob bosses, right? That's how he got the concrete to build Trump Tower? Or am I missing something?
No, there's, well, the truth is with Epstein, I think it's an incredibly Byzantine maze, because you have to wonder who really had and has the compromise. Epstein's lawyers would have had access to it, and they were from this giant law firm, Kirkland & Ellis, which included William Barr, Alex Acosta, who was Secretary of Labor and gave the sweetheart deal to Epstein, to a lot of major high-ranking people in Trump's Justice Department. People like Brian Benkowski was head of the criminal division. He was part of that group at Kirkland & Ellis. So there's a lot of that. Also, the Epstein operation, it's clear Epstein had links to Russians himself. I interviewed an Israeli agent who said in the late 80s, around 1988, he saw Epstein at Albert Maxwell's office, that's Lynn's father, in London, and with Ehud Barak, who later became Israeli prime minister, at the time was minister of intelligence. So there are certainly a lot of questions about Epstein's links to intelligence. If you recall, Alex Acosta, the Secretary of Labor, said he was told not Epstein because he was with intelligence. And when Epstein died, we don't know if that was suicide or murder. And
what's your opinion?
I think that, it's just hard for so many things to go wrong. Coincidences can't take place at one time, is my view. But to me, it's really an unsolved murder right now.
You mean like the video surveillance cameras were shut down, the guards that were normally there were taken away, and then, he's dead. Is that what you're talking about?
Absolutely. And he was probably the most vulnerable person in the entire prison system here in New York. So how could that possibly have gone wrong? But
is New York looking into that?
I can't get all the answers to that, to be honest. The other material uncovered that I think is new is about and is really, really relevant if you look at the hacking that's been going on. This is the whole SolarWinds scandal and the massive hacking that is just now being uncovered that the Russians did with our government. Is the question of did that go through Jeffrey Epstein? Because Epstein himself has ties, a lot of ties with Silicon Valley and science of technology. He met several times with Bill Gates, with Elon Musk. He had ties to the big tech wizards at MIT and Harvard. And some of these people, a number of them were working with them in that regard.
Stick around, Craig. Hang on. Hey, my new book is out. The Hidden History of American Oligarchy, Reclaiming Our Democracy from the Ruling Class. In this book, I trace the history of the struggle against oligarchy from America's founding to the United States' war with the feudal confederacy to President Franklin Roosevelt's struggle against economic royalists who wanted to block the New Deal. In each of those cases, the oligarchs lost the battle. But with increasing right-wing control, we're at a crisis point. Want to know more? You can sign up for 3 virtual book events. Powell's virtual event, In Conversation with David Korten, is Tuesday, February 2nd at 5 p.m. Pacific Time. The Seattle Town Hall virtual event is Thursday, February 4th at 6 p.m. Pacific Time. And the Books and Books virtual event, In Conversation with David Korten, is Tuesday, February 9th at 4 p.m. Pacific Time. Come support your local bookstores and hear about my new book on oligarchy. The links are all over at thomhartmann.com. And welcome back. We're talking with Craig Unger, his new book, American KOMPROMAT. So, Craig, I want to, in this last 7 or 8 minutes we've got, just really nail this down, or 6 minutes, I guess we've got. Have you found evidence that Donald Trump, when he was president of the United States, was actively working on behalf of Russia or in ways that furthered Russian interests, where you could tie that to something, whether he was being blackmailed, whether he was being bribed, whether he was being promised future opportunities, whatever?
Well, he was regarded by Russian intelligence and the KGB before it as a special unofficial contact, and that's different from being an active agent who can be with certain operations. It's a slightly more informal designation where he's a trusted friend. He can be relied upon to do favors for Russia. And he did that again and again and again. I mean, we saw it in Helsinki. I mean, it was a constant refrain when he was president. But you also see various actions that, some of which were technically quite legal, but nonetheless, he was acting as a Russian agent for asset. That is, just before the 2016 election, you had Donald Trump Jr. giving a speech in France at a French think tank. He was paid over $50,000 for it. And, of course, all of that is perfectly legal. What is interesting, though, is the think tank was widely regarded as a front for Russian intelligence. And they were passing to Donald Jr. their talking points for what they wanted his father to do as president in the Middle East. Sure enough, once Trump became president, he did exactly what the Russians wanted. He withdrew American troops from Syria. He abandoned our Kurdish allies and left the Russians in a dominant position in that vitally important strategic area. And what my book does, it shows one after another event like that happening again and again and again, and that Trump is effectively working as a Russian asset. And according to Yuri Shvets, that's precisely what he was.
Do you think he was taking these actions because they had succeeded in, some may say brainwashing, but the Russians have a point of view of the world and themselves that he had simply adopted their worldview as opposed to the American worldview? And I'm thinking of, blowing up the Iran nuclear deal, although Russia was a party to that, but Iran is an ally of Russia's. Pulling the U.S. out of NATO or threatening to, and certainly taking a meat axe to NATO in general. The same thing with the United Nations. The same thing with his anti-climate stuff, because oil is one of the principal funders of the Russian government. Are these evidence of quid pro quo kinds of corruption, or I'm afraid that the PP tapes are going to come out kind of corruption, or are they simply Donald Trump really believes that what's good for Russia is also good for America?
Right. I don't think it's what he naturally he believes. He's about what's good for Donald Trump. And he does something for Russia, they do something for him. And we don't know all the answers yet, but we can see certainly hundreds of millions of dollars flooding into him. And, I mean, take the money laundering series alone. Someone gives you $5 or $10 million, you turn the other cheek and you turn a blind eye to it, you get rich. You keep doing that again and again, 1,300 times. It's not necessary to have put it in on paper, to do a private contract, to even spell it out verbally. This is just a guy coming to you with all money, and you accept it. And then when the same people suggest you do something or you tell you what's in their interest, you help them out. They do a favor for you, you do one for them. And I think that's the way it's been working most of the time. That said, they do have enormous amount of material over him. Think of all the conversations he's had with Vladimir Putin. The American people do not have access to those conversations, and they're vitally important in national security terms. Vladimir Putin does. He can release them at any time, and Trump knows that. And there more than likely is sexual compromise on him. And I would also say now we're at a real turning point with Trump out of office. He can't really do much for them anymore. And Putin is the relationship is much, much weaker. So I would not be surprised if Putin tries to reset things with Biden, and that may include releasing some of the compromise everyone's been wanting to see.
Oh, that's interesting. So you think Putin's ready to throw him under the bus?
Well, Putin's in real trouble now, too. Partly it's Navalny, who, I mean, as our interview began, was just sentenced to another 2.5 years in jail. So right. He is threatened there, and he no longer has Trump as an asset. So he is much weaker, and he might try to reset things, or at least that's what my sources tell me.
Well, that wouldn't be a bad thing, would it?
Not so much, but he is under threat from other sources as well. From Nikolai Patrushev is head of the FSB.
He being Putin or Trump?
Putin is. Been reports of medical problems and so forth. So I think there's going to be a lot of unstable things are not very stable anymore.
Fascinating stuff. Craig, thanks for the research, thanks for writing the book, and thanks for coming on the program here and laying it all out for us. I really appreciate it. Craig Unger, the book is American KOMPROMAT. Craig, thanks. Keep up the great work.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate it, Tom.
Mm-hmm. My pleasure, Craig. We'll be right back.
You're listening to Thom Hartmann.
These companies support the Thom Hartmann Program. They are CB Distillery, CBD for sleeping. More info at cbdistillery.com, code TOM. The Clean Phone Pro, phone sanitizer and charger. More info at thenewdealshop.com. Plexiderm, real science, real results. More info at plexiderm.com, code TOM. ExpressVPN, the VPN that just works. More information at expressvpn.com/Tom. Gabby takes the pain out of insurance shopping. More info at gabby.com/Tom. HelloFresh, the #1 meal kit delivery service. More info at hellofresh.com, code TOM. And Superbeats, heart chews for heart healthy energy. More info at superbeatsradio.com/Tom.
Today's book in our book club is The Hidden History of the War on Voting, Who Stole Your Vote and How to Get It Back, by this guy, Thom Hartmann. This is from chapter 1, or from the introduction, actually. In 2016, 6% of Americans who were eligible to vote nominated Donald Trump as the GOP's presidential candidate. It was 8% for Hillary Clinton on the Democratic side. Trump went on to be elected president by 26% of eligible voters. The modern American oligarchs have largely stayed in power using 3 simple elements: explicit and overt racism, massive disinformation campaigns, and voter suppression. No ideas, no push for better schools, hospitals, airports, roads, or bridges, or reform of our health, energy, or financial systems. No promise of more and better jobs. None of these staples of past presidential campaigns can be found in pretty much any Republican advertising today. Instead, the public Republican message is all about race, or the subset of race, religion. Muslim stands in for brown Arab in GOP speak, and immigration, aka brown people from south of our border, and socialism. Meanwhile, Republican secretaries of state across the nation are vigorously purging voters from the rolls. Over 17 million, more than 10% of America's active voters, in just the 2016-2018 period, according to NBC News. After the 5 Republican appointees on the U.S. Supreme Court gutted the Voting Rights Act in 2013, 14 GOP-controlled states moved within a year, some within days, to restrict access to the vote, particularly for communities of color, students, and retired people. In North Carolina, for example, 158 polling places were permanently closed in the 40 counties with the most African-American voters just before the 2016 election, leading to a 16% decline in African-American early voting in that state. An MIT study found that nationwide, Hispanic voters wait 150% longer in line than white voters, and black voters can expect to wait 200% longer in line to vote. In Indiana, then Governor Mike Pence's new rigorous voter ID law caused an 11.5% drop in African-American voting. Students are suing for their right to vote, and retired people who no longer drive but care passionately about their Social Security and Medicare are being turned away at the polls by the hundreds of thousands because their driver's licenses have expired. The obvious failure of 40-plus years of Reaganomics and GOP policies to maintain a functional middle class in America has been a problem for the modern GOP. In 1974, for example, the GOP had outright control of only 7 states. The message, elect us and we'll help the rich people, just didn't generally resonate with American voters. It's the reason why, outside of the fluke elections of 46 and 52, Democrats controlled the House of Representatives outright for 3 generations, from 1933 to 1996, and controlled the Senate for most of that time. Desperate to win the presidency for the GOP in 1968, Richard Nixon went so far as to commit treason by torpedoing a peace deal with President Lyndon Johnson that President Lyndon Johnson had worked out with the North and South Vietnamese. According to Abul Hassan Bani Sadr, then president of Iran, Ronald Reagan did the same thing by cutting a deal with Iran whereby they would hold on to the U.S. embassy hostages until after the 1980 presidential election, torpedoing Jimmy Carter's chances of re-election. But in 2000, the GOP changed tactics. After Reagan was almost busted for his part in Iran-Contra, he testified that he had forgotten about details of the program more than 80 times. His growing Alzheimer's spared him an indictment. They realized that getting busted for treason wasn't worth the risk. They needed a plan B, and it was deliciously simple. If most voters don't like what you're selling, then just don't let them vote. Paul Wayward promoted this idea back in 1980 when he was campaigning for Reagan after co-founding the Heritage Foundation. And indeed, many Republican luminaries, such as William Rehnquist, who went from serving the GOP by standing in polling places and intimidating Hispanic and Native American voters in the 1960s, to becoming Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, rose up through the ranks by participating in Republican-run voter intimidation schemes. Voter suppression became the foundational go-to tactic for the GOP in 2000. Although the GOP attacked Democratic presidential nominee Al Gore with smear and innuendo, ridiculing him for helping write the legislation that created the modern internet, for example, the main thing that got George W. Bush into the White House was voter suppression. His brother, Florida Governor Jeb Bush, and Bush's Secretary of State, Katherine Harris, threw somewhere between 20,000 and 90,000 African-American voters off the rolls. They were able to get the vote close enough. The 5 Republican appointees to the Supreme Court functionally awarded Bush the presidency. The BBC covered this in 2001 in 2 major investigative reports that were seen all over the world, except on any American media. By 2016, the Republican Party had fine-tuned its voter suppression and intimidation systems to the point that they ran like well-oiled machines in nearly 30 states. Between the 2012 and 2016 presidential elections, for example, Ohio had purged more than 2 million voters from its rolls, the vast majority, more than 2-to-1, in heavily African-American and Hispanic counties. The 5 Republican appointees on the Supreme Court ruled in 2017 that they could keep it up. And other states have since adopted their new tactic of caging voters. The book, The Hidden History of the War on Voting, by me.
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
Thom Hartmann here. Getting back to our conversation about what is freedom, the different meanings of freedom, how billionaire conservatives are defining freedom, how you and I are defining freedom, in about 15 minutes. But right now, Barry C. Lynn is with us. He's the director of the Open Markets Institute. He's got a new book out, Liberty from All Masters. OpenMarketsInstitute.org is the website. Barry C. Lynn, Lynn, is his Twitter handle, or at Open Markets. And Barry, welcome back to the program. It's always great to hear from you. You are off on a new hunt here. With this brilliant science piece, this whole idea that the food monopolies are creating a crisis. I've talked many times on this program about how, when Reagan stopped enforcing the monopoly laws back in 1983, that this led to a disaster in family farms. And, I had friends who had family farms in Michigan back in the day. And, Willie Nelson was up there doing farm aid, trying to help these people out because these giant ag businesses were just running them out of business. But apparently it's reincarnated. There's a new problem. Tell us about it.
Oh, yeah, it's great to be back on the show, Tom. It's you've been a leading voice on this for many years at this point. And, the problem now is, what we're seeing is that the consolidation of power over our agricultural systems, our farm systems, our food systems, we've been approaching it mainly as an issue of how it affects the ownership. It's like who gets to be a farmer, who gets to sort of own land, who gets to raise livestock, and how do you raise that livestock? And those are still extremely important issues that we are fighting with on a day-to-day basis all across this country. But there's this other problem, which we're actually just really starting to focus on now in a real way, which is the way in which consolidated agriculture affects the environment, affects our lives. I mean, one of the things that our group did this year, Open Markets, is we did a bunch of work just looking at how consolidation in the slaughterhouse industry contributed to the COVID epidemic in a number of ways. And actually, this is people have looked at this somewhat, but this is a new frontier for really sort of both understanding monopoly, the dangers of it, and fighting monopoly.
And you're suggesting that Joe Biden specifically do something about this, that this can be done by executive action, and I'm assuming legislation? Excuse me.
Yeah, no, I mean, that's actually one of the, absolutely legislation. Congress the people are sovereign through Congress. We can kind of do what we want, as you know. But the executive has immense power to change this. The Department of Agriculture has, and this is something we've forgotten, the Department of Agriculture, going back to the 1920s, has immense rulemaking authority. It can essentially create markets, establish markets, regulate markets as it sees fit. And that means that it can, if it wants to make sort of essentially outlaw Tyson's, if it wants to outlaw JBS, if it wants to outlaw Smithfield, it can do so. Tom Vilsack, who's a new head of the Department of Agriculture, he can do so. And there's that's something that our group has looked at in great depth, which is the rulemaking authority of the executive.
Has Vilsack's nomination passed through the Senate yet?
They're actually having the hearing today.
Interesting.
Actually, I haven't checked to see what the result was thus far. And people should remember that Tom Vilsack was Secretary of Agriculture under Obama for 8 years, and during which time he did nothing to fight monopoly, and pretty much everything he could to sort of foster further consolidation.
Well, I've heard him described as the man from Monsanto. I don't know if that's a reasonable description, but it seems unlikely that he would ban any of these companies. But, the FCC, for example, used to have local ownership rules around radio and television stations that many people are calling for a return to that would effectively, from the bottom up rather than the top down, I guess, would break up these giant monopolies, that only program right-wing talk radio. Would it not be possible to do something like that? I mean, what are the specifics of policy that you'd like to see put into place that would protect the family farm and also perhaps minimize the massive environmental damage, both locally in terms of waste and globally in terms of emitted methane, that's being done by these massive hog, beef and chicken operations that are owned by this small handful of very wealthy companies?
Yeah, and actually just simply moving towards a more diversified, more distributed farming system, actually, the small family farms, just moving physically towards a system that reinforces the small family farm, and
how do we do that?
When it comes to livestock, that can be, it's like that immediately begins to deal with a lot of the environmental problems, because you're actually distributing waste. You're distributing, across the landscape. You're not concentrating it in a couple of places. You're not putting all this amazing stress on a couple of certain sort of water supplies, under certain parts of our country. But how do you do that? Again, it's like, we can do this legislatively. The Tom Vilsack can begin to do this tomorrow. Or as soon as he sits down in that seat, he can begin to use the power that was put into the USDA by Congress for precisely crises such as this. Now, you say, well, is he going to do it? Well, Tom Vilsack has shown no inclination whatsoever to actually do it. But the Biden administration, we've seen a lot of good action, a lot of good intent on their part in actually dealing with monopoly. They seem to be elevating a number of very good people in different positions across the executive. So there are people in the White House who we are pretty confident have some inkling of how bad the situation is. And so there is an opportunity here for the White House, for Joe Biden, basically to call his friend Tom Vilsack and say, Tom, why don't you really start to use your power and fix this?
Yeah. Barry, we're talking with Barry C. Lynn. We have about a minute and a half left, Barry. What's the appropriate response to this? Is it to say no livestock operation can have more than 1,000 animals, or that no agricultural operation can be bigger than 1,000 acres? I mean, how do you do it? What's the entry point?
Well, in the old days, it's like every farm was about 160 acres. This is one of the very first laws in the United States. The Northwest Ordinance, that's what when we plotted out the land, we cut it into 160 acre sections. Quarter sections. Mm-hmm. Right up for 200 years, we still had farms that were basically about 160, 200 acres.
That's 1/4 of a square mile, isn't it? Isn't a square mile 640 acres?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. So it's like, we can actually begin to do this right now, just sort of by limiting the power of the processors. The processors, it's actually the retailers and the processors are the ones that have exercised power over the farming system that has resulted in this pressure on farmers to consolidate, this pressure that has driven thousands, tens of thousands, millions of farmers off their land. So what we've seen is this mass expropriation of American farmers, this mass sort of displacement of American farmers, and we can reverse that now. The power is in Biden's hands, and for the first time, I think we have a president who understands that he can do this. We'll see if he does.
That's great. The White House comment line, by the way, is 202-456-1111. Barry C. Lynn, the director of the Open Markets Institute, his new book, Liberty from All Masters. Barry, thanks.
Hey, great to talk to you again.
This is the Thom
Barry.
Hartmann Program.
We'll be back. I want to get into our conversation about what does freedom mean and how do we explain this to conservatives. Stick around. And welcome back. Our telephone number, 202-808-9925. Tim in Los Angeles. Hey, Tim, what's on your mind today?
Oh, that caller that you had earlier, the woman that was in tears over her aunt dying,
Michelle.
It just really, it gutted me. I think Free Speech should put that on as an ad, just, one of their ads in between the programs. I called all my congressmen and senators and today and begged them to please get rid of the filibuster and put the vice president in charge of the Senate and get this stuff through. People are dying, for Christ's sake.
Yep.
And
I'm completely with you.
It's remarkable the amount of it reminds me of I don't remember what comedy program it was that used to have this segment about the middle management suck ups. Like there would be like a tornado coming towards the high rise, and they would all like run into the conference room and start doing flow charts and shit, And that's what it's.
Yeah, Tim, we can't use that word on the air. I'm sorry, I got to drop your call. It just there's some things you just can't say on the air. Hang on just a second. Let me get into my producer mode here. Mick in Seattle. Hey, Mick, what's on your mind today?
Good morning, Tom. Glad to hear your voice again.
Thank you.
Would like to say, in as simply as I can put it, that so everyone can understand it, because it's in all religions actually, is the golden rule is the term for freedom, is the definition. Ones that follow it know about it, practice it. They walk their talk. And I find that that's the best way to go about your day, is watching those people modeling the golden rule.
Which is basically a call for empathy, do unto others as you would have them do unto you, is, an old way of saying walk a mile in the other person's shoes, that sort of thing. Is that's what you're talking about, Mick, I assume?
It is.
If I'm remembering the golden rule right.
Well, the golden rule, so it's basically said and put so simply that if you don't want it done to you, don't do it to others, yes. But then there's the platinum rule. The platinum rule says if you were in their shoes, how would you make it better? Now, if
that's interesting.
Our government and our everyday life, we will be successful in achieving what we're trying to achieve, perfection. We'll never get there, but we will be working in that direction.
Yeah, and I'm hopeful that as the voices of people who have had different life experiences than probably a lot of our viewers or listeners come out on this program, and as I believe her name was Michelle did, that people can be touched not just intellectually but deep in their hearts. And get that we're all in this together. We're all human beings here, and we're in the middle of just a god-awful crisis that didn't have to happen. And I'm not just talking about the situation with COVID. Nick, thank you for the call. It's the golden rule. I salute it. It's coming up on 20 minutes past the hour. We'll be back with a little bit more of the news of the day, but mostly your calls right after this, so stick around. You can find an absolutely fascinating library of my writings, including my daily rants, over at thomhartmann.medium.com. Hey, my new book is out. The Hidden History of American Oligarchy, Reclaiming Our Democracy from the Ruling Class. In this book, I trace the history of the struggle against oligarchy from America's founding to the United States' war with the feudal Confederacy to President Franklin Roosevelt's struggle against economic royalists who wanted to block the New Deal. In each of those cases, the oligarchs lost the battle. But with increasing right-wing control, we're at a crisis point. Want to know more? You can sign up for 3 virtual book events. Powell's virtual event in conversation with David Corton is Tuesday, February 2nd at 5 p.m. Pacific time. The Seattle Town Hall virtual event is Thursday, February 4th at 6 p.m. Pacific time. And the Books and Books virtual event in conversation with David Corton is Tuesday, February 9th at 4 p.m. Pacific time. Come support your local bookstores and hear about my new book on oligarchy. The links are all over at thomhartmann.com. And welcome back. Just a couple of things I wanted to share with you very quickly that have kind of flown past my notice or flown by my notice or in front of me over the last 24 hours. One of the things that is on the Biden agenda, the Democratic agenda right now, is raising the minimum wage to $15 an hour. Now, it's going to be staged. It'll take 4 or 5 years to happen. And $15 an hour is, it's puts you kind of solidly in the median, more or less, as an individual wage earner. But we're not talking huge money here by any stretch of the imagination. The sales pitch against raising the minimum wage that is made by conservatives on conservative media, that you'll hear on Fox News, that you'll hear on right-wing hate radio, is that the only people earning the minimum wage are teenagers who work part-time after school, who live with their parents, and they just want some extra spending money. You will hear this repeated over and over and over again. And I'll tell you, when I was, I think I was 14 years old. I might have been 15. So this would have been like 1965, way back in the misty, distant past. My first job was at Henry's Hamburgers, which was about 1.5 miles from the house where my parents lived. I lived with them. I walked to work every day. I had to get a work permit from the city of Lansing to do it because I was under 16. And I was in that category. I was a teenager who wanted a little extra money, and I lived with my parents. That was the reality 50 years ago. In fact, I think that's almost 60 years ago. That's not the reality anymore. And when you hear Republicans and right-wing media talking about this, you kind of need to, throw some water in their face. Wake the hell up. You can't. The average age of a minimum wage worker in the United States might have been 16 back in 1965, but today, the average age of a minimum wage worker, $7.25 an hour, is 35. 90% of all minimum wage workers are over 20 years old. Almost 60% of them, 59% of minimum wage workers, are women. 28% of all minimum wage workers have children. 54% of them work full-time for a minimum wage, which is, works out to about $15,000 a year. I mean, this is just crazy. And the majority of those people who would benefit from the minimum wage being raised are essential and frontline workers, because this is where you find lots and lots of minimum wage workers. This is from an infographic that was produced by EPI, the Economic Policy Institute. EPI.org is their website. And they're talking about the Raise the Wage Act 2021. And they say the EPI research shows that raising the minimum wage would lift the pay of nearly 32 million workers across America, 21% of the U.S. workforce. So 1 in 5 people in America is earning poverty wages, wages that guarantee people live a poverty lifestyle. 1 out of every 5, in fact, a little more than 1 out of every 5 of the workers in the United States. How can we tolerate this? This is insane. The other thing I wanted to share with you is Katie Porter shared this remarkable story. AOC, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, and Katie Porter were hiding in Katie's office when the Capitol was stormed. And there were people storming the Capitol who were yelling AOC and who were specifically targeting, they specifically were looking to kill her. That was their mission. And she knew it. And they shut the lights off, they pulled the curtains, they did all this stuff that we're now teaching our children to do in our schools because the NRA has so proliferated guns across America. And Katie Porter said, and I quote, "Alex is really usually like unfailingly polite and very personable, and she was opening up doors and I was like, can I help you? What are you looking for?" And she said, "I'm looking for a place to hide." And she said, at that point, Ocasio-Cortez said to Katie Porter, "I hope I get to be a mom. I hope I don't die today." Porter said, "We stayed dark. We shut the windows, the curtains, we turned our phones off, we silenced everything. And we just sat, as still and quiet as we could be, and just hoped that they would just run on by," which eventually they did. And then Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez has come out today and said that, she was the victim of sexual assault when she was younger or at some point in her life. She didn't give any details, to the best of my knowledge. But she said that, this kind of statement, like, Nikki Haley saying day before yesterday, just get over it, move on. And, Lindsey Graham has said things like this. Mitch McConnell has said that, a bunch of these guys have said basically, move along. Ted Cruz, Josh Hawley. And Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez says, that's what abusers say. That's what rapists say. That's what killers say. This is in domestic abuse. This is what domestic abuse. Just get over it. I think that we need to reconcile is not even quite the right word. First of all, we need to start out by holding Donald Trump accountable, but I think we also need to hold accountable those members of Congress who helped incite this thing.
You're listening to the Thom Hartmann Program. Call 202-808-9925.
In my opinion, Josh Hawley, Kevin McCarthy, and Ted Cruz have actually committed treason and need to be held to account for it.
Today's book in our book club is The Hidden History of the War on Voting, Who Stole Your Vote and How to Get It Back, by this guy, Thom Hartmann. This is from chapter 1, or from the introduction, actually. In 2016, 6% of Americans who were eligible to vote nominated Donald Trump as the GOP's presidential candidate. It was 8% for Hillary Clinton on the Democratic side. Trump went on to be elected president by 26% of eligible voters. The modern American oligarchs have largely stayed in power using 3 simple elements: explicit and overt racism, massive disinformation campaigns, and voter suppression. No ideas, no push for better schools, hospitals, airports, roads, or bridges, or reform of our health, energy, or financial systems. No promise of more and better jobs. None of these staples of past presidential campaigns can be found in pretty much any Republican advertising today. Instead, the public Republican message is all about race, or the subset of race, religion. Muslim stands in for brown Arab in GOP speak, and immigration, aka brown people from south of our border, and socialism. Meanwhile, Republican secretaries of state across the nation are vigorously purging voters from the rolls. over 17 million, more than 10% of America's active voters, in just the 2016-2018 period, according to NBC News. After the 5 Republican appointees on the U.S. Supreme Court gutted the Voting Rights Act in 2013, 14 GOP-controlled states moved within a year, some within days, to restrict access to the vote, particularly for communities of color, students, and retired people. In North Carolina, for example, 158 polling places were permanently closed in the 40 counties with the most African-American voters just before the 2016 election, leading to a 16% decline in African-American early voting in that state. An MIT study found that nationwide, Hispanic voters wait 150% longer in line than white voters, and black voters can expect to wait 200% longer in line to vote. In Indiana, then Governor Mike Pence's new rigorous voter ID law caused an 11.5% drop in African-American voting. Students are suing for their right to vote, and retired people who no longer drive but care passionately about their Social Security and Medicare are being turned away at the polls by the hundreds of thousands because their driver's licenses have expired. The obvious failure of 40-plus years of Reaganomics and GOP policies to maintain a functional middle class in America has been a problem for the modern GOP. In 1974, for example, the GOP had outright control of only 7 states. The message, elect us and we'll help the rich people, just didn't generally resonate with American voters. It's the reason why, outside of the fluke elections of 46 and 52, Democrats controlled the House of Representatives outright for 3 generations, from 1933 to 1996, and controlled the Senate for most of that time. Desperate to win the presidency for the GOP in 1968, Richard Nixon went so far as to commit treason by torpedoing a peace deal with President Lyndon Johnson that President Lyndon Johnson had worked out with the North and South Vietnamese. According to Abul Hassan Bani Sadr, then president of Iran, Ronald Reagan did the same thing by cutting a deal with Iran whereby they would hold on to the U.S. embassy hostages until after the 1980 presidential election, torpedoing Jimmy Carter's chances of re-election. But in 2000, the GOP changed tactics. After Reagan was almost busted for his part in Iran-Contra, he testified that he had forgotten about details of the program more than 80 times. His growing Alzheimer's spared him an indictment. They realized that getting busted for treason wasn't worth the risk. They needed a plan B. And it was deliciously simple. If most voters don't like what you're selling, then just don't let them vote. Paul Weyrich promoted this idea back in 1980 when he was campaigning for Reagan after co-founding the Heritage Foundation. And indeed, many Republican luminaries, such as William Rehnquist, who went from serving the GOP by standing in polling places and intimidating Hispanic and Native American voters in the 1960s, to becoming Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, rose up through the ranks by participating in Republican-run voter intimidation schemes. Voter suppression became the foundational go-to tactic for the GOP in 2000. Although the GOP attacked Democratic presidential nominee Al Gore with smear and innuendo, ridiculing him for helping write the legislation that created the modern internet, for example, the main thing that got George W. Bush into the White House was voter suppression. His brother, Florida Governor Jeb Bush, and Bush's Secretary of State, Katherine Harris, threw somewhere between 20,000 and 90,000 African-American voters off the rolls. They were able to get the vote close enough that 5 Republican appointees to the Supreme Court functionally awarded Bush the presidency. The BBC covered this in 2001 in 2 major investigative reports that were seen all over the world, except on any American media. By 2016, the Republican Party had fine-tuned its voter suppression and intimidation systems to the point that they ran like well-oiled machines in nearly 30 states. Between the 2012 and 2016 presidential elections, for example, Ohio had purged more than 2 million voters from its rolls, the vast majority, more than 2 to 1, in heavily African-American and Hispanic counties. The 5 Republican appointees on the Supreme Court ruled in 2017 that they could keep it up. And other states have since adopted their new tactic of caging voters. The book, The Hidden History of the War on Voting, by me.
Hey, my new book is out, The Hidden History of American Oligarchy, Reclaiming Our Democracy from the Ruling Class. Want to know more? The links are all over at thomhartmann.com. You know, there's so much news coming out of the Trump administration, so much corruption, so many crimes. Oh, you know, now they're letting people kill endangered species. Now they're selling off, you know, the Arctic National Wildlife Preserve refuge rather to big oil companies. Oh, now they're they're authorizing pesticides that we know cause birth defects and damage to children. It's just, you know, step after step after step that it's so easy to forget that back in July of 2020, it was reported that Jared Kushner and Mike Pence's nephew, John Pence, created a couple of LLCs, American-Made Media Consultants Corporation, that took $617 million of Trump campaign cash, and nobody knows where it went. I'm telling you, these guys are professional grifters. We need to keep an eye on it. There's a whole rant about it over at thomhartmann.com for supporters of our program. And welcome back. Thom Hartmann here with you and Maverick in Edmonds, Washington. Hey, Maverick, what's on your mind today? Whoa.
You know, if you're the number one progressive talk radio show in America, doesn't that make you the number one progressive talk radio show in the world?
I don't know, Maverick. I'm uncomfortable even using that label. There's some very, very good talk talent out there. We have a good sized audience. You know, thank God. I think it's more persistence. We've been doing this 18 years than anything else. What's on your mind, though?
All right. So, you know, you were talking about. I guess the question of the day was, what is freedom, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I came up with, you know, you're a writer. I've done a little bit of writing, mostly commercial stuff. But as a writer, you have to expand sometimes and you have to minimize sometimes. And I don't know, I just thought about minimizing what freedom is because it's a huge subject. And I tried to narrow it down to as few words as possible, and I came up with one word. What is freedom? And I got responsibility. And if it's not responsibility directly, the two of them are so inseparable that you really can't have one without the other. For example,
well, I think you could say freedom without responsibility is anarchy. It's chaos, right?
You're writing it for me, buddy. You're writing it for me. So yeah, you can't really have one without the other. Even if you're alone on a tropical island and you say, okay, I don't have to answer to anyone. So I've got ultimate freedom? Well, no, because if you do something silly, you could hurt yourself, and then you have to suffer the consequences. So you're still responsible for having a certain minimum behavior that that's where freedom. They're inextricably linked. Freedom and responsibility. I don't know. Might not be brilliant, but that's my contribution today.
I think it's a great one. I completely think it's a great one. Maverick, thank you very much for that. Kim in Sarasota, Florida. Hey, Kim, you're up.
Hey, how you doing? I think that freedom is a state of mind and not an attainable reality whatsoever. And the reason I say that is freedom, the word freedom, has become a tagline. The GIs are fighting for our freedoms in Vietnam, but they got there because of the draft. Walmart is giving us the freedom of choice to make it convenient and cheap to buy stuff, but they wiped out all the little businesses who keep a community running. So it's basically the dominant of our species that control the lesser of us. And we only get as much as they will allow us to have. Your thoughts?
I love your concept that freedom is a state of mind, because as we know, there are people running around saying that my freedom is being taken away if I have to wear a mask. Obviously, it's not one objective thing that we can all agree has some kind of a definition. And when I go driving, I drive on the right side of the road here in the United States. I stop for stop signs and red lights. Those are all things that inhibit my freedom to drive however I want. We are all constrained all the time in all kinds of ways. There are certain things I can't say on the radio, certain words I can't say on the air, for example, but I don't feel unfree.
I don't either. I watched a documentary by Vice News or whatever called Fringe Nation, and it gets into the different anarchist groups, the Boogaloo Boys, blah, 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 blah. And the guy the interviewers kept asking, what is freedom? They're taking our freedoms away. They didn't have an answer. Their answer was to do exactly like you were saying. If you want to drive on the right side of the road, you can drive on the right side. If you want to drive on the left side, you can. That, it's a state of mind. It's how you were raised, where you were raised, the community as a group thinking kind of molds our personalities to a point. And those that sit on the fringes and want to have purple hair or, whatever, aren't free to do that because society pushes that back, which is good. But it's gotten so messy.
Why would individual expression in terms of your appearance, I mean, I back in the 60s, I had hair down below my shoulders. Actually, I did it in 2001 as well. Why would society trying to punish me for that be a good thing?
Society as a rule doesn't. It's individual communities of personalities. It's not a good thing. I didn't like it. I had straight hair split down the middle, and everybody thought I did dope just because of that. Simple things. It's just there is no true freedom, and the word has been stolen and used as this big tarp to recruit guys to go shoot other people in other countries and to police the streets. They're protecting our freedoms. What freedoms? I mean, we self-impose our own freedom. Now, the government, like I said, there's dominance between in societies. So government is the top dog, and then it comes down from there. But you also have neighborhoods and group leaders that are dominant, and they push their freedoms onto you and what's acceptable to them. So it's an individual.
And vice versa. I mean, we live in essentially a rule-based society. I mean, where I live, there's a homeowners association. I can't just paint my house pink tomorrow, without somebody coming down on me with a fine or something, or going to court to force me to not do that. I don't feel unfree as a consequence of it. In fact, I would say that having a community that has established certain standards that in many cases have to do with more safety than anything else. I mean, painting your house is probably not the best example of that, but is arguably a good thing. But I know that people chafe at homeowners associations and things. It's a huge topic. Kim. Yeah, there you go. Kim, thank you. You've opened up quite a conversation here. I appreciate it, and did so very elegantly. Bill in Redmond, Washington. Hey, Bill, you're on the air.
Well, excuse me, I've been listening, and one of the things I point out that we can use freedom in so many ways, it becomes a buzzword for anything. And in my writing recently, you've heard the phrase often, with freedom and liberty. Well, I make the distinction that freedom is a classical definition, the absence of restraints. I can do whatever they want. Those people attacking OCA and whatever, they were free to do that. So rather than just reiterating the word freedom, I'm suggesting liberties are things we grant to each other. A couple examples. A soldier gets a weekend liberty. It's something that is granted to him. And, of course, with that granting, there are obligations. He's got to come back. More commonly, we talk about maybe a young lady or woman, don't take liberties with me. Liberty suggests some kind of a mutual agreement that would also require an obligation to follow through and any other things that one of your previous callers talked about, responsibility. If I grant you some liberties and you mutually return that favor, if you will, then we have an obligation to each other. And, of course, if we expand that into the community and beyond, it becomes a word that maybe the Democrats should adopt and just forget the word freedom, because the word freedom, I'm reminded of Milton Friedman in his little book, Freedom and Democracy. He goes on to say that morality is defined as what permits me to do what I want with the resources I have. Well, that's just another way of talking about freedom. And there's nothing moral about it. Matter of fact, it's immoral. So we can distort the word freedom all we want, but I think we ought to expand our vocabulary and make a difference. We've got a Statue of Liberty, you've got the Goddess of Liberty on the top of the Capitol building, and take that word, liberty, and build on that as something that is a mutual agreed upon, that carries with it obligations and responsibilities. And that's my piece for the day.
Okay. Well, you did it very well, Bill. Thank you very much. And you inspired me to go grab Franklin Roosevelt's speech where he said that very word freedom implies restraint from some external force, as I recall. I'm going to find it and share a little bit of it with you and pick up the rest of your phone calls here on the other side of this break. It's 45 minutes past the hour. Stick around. Thom Hartmann with you.
You're listening to Thom Hartmann. Visit thomhartmann.com for audio and video archives.
We'll be right back. We're talking about freedom. What does that word mean? And welcome back. Brad, hey, Brad, you're listening on Sirius XM. Let me put you on hold and I'll pick you up on the other side of the break. Freda, watching Free Speech TV in Bella Vista, Arkansas. You are still live and on the air. Hey, Freda, what's up?
I was listening to you talking about the corporate meat farms and running small farms out of business, and I experienced that here in Arkansas. In the 80s, I had a small farm, 7 acres, and it was it turned out to have a pig farm built just east of me, and the water started running out, smelling like pig shit. And finally,
Freda, I'm sorry, you just can't say that word on the air, and I have to drop you because there's FCC consequences to it if we don't apologize to everybody for words like that getting on the air and et cetera. So my apologies, Freda. Next time you call, be careful. I know you're well intentioned. You're not one of these folks who just wanted to do that, but we just can't do it. Julian in Los Angeles. Hey, Julian, what's on your mind today?
Hi, Tom. I live in East Los Angeles, California, and it's a very, very crowded area. So this idea of Second Amendment freedom is ridiculous. We've had a big problem with murders in the 80s and going into the 90s. There was a big gang problems here. So they have to clamp down. And then with putting in all the freeways and everything, it separates the communities and it became rivalries. So this whole idea about freedom, as the cities get bigger, I mean, here in Southern California, you can't have that cowboy mentality that they're going to take away my gun. You can't. As a matter of fact, if they abolished the gun laws, make them like the militias and like it's supposed to, like as it was written. Thanks.
You mean, in other words, if we were to interpret the Second Amendment the way that the framers, the people who actually wrote it, intended, then the only right to bear arms in the United States would be, explicit right to bear arms, would be for members of the National Guard in the individual states. Is that what you're talking about?
Yes, in a county like the size of Los Angeles, you can't have those. We don't have all those freedoms. We want to live in a city, that offers the opportunity for employment and for beautiful things. You have to also go along with you can't be a cowboy. You can't carry arms. You can't go around assaulting people. You have to drive.
It's two different freedoms, Julian. On the one hand, forgive the interruption, but we're going to hit a break here in a second. On the one hand, you have the freedom to own a gun and carry it. On the other hand, you've got the freedom. I would like to have the freedom to know that when I go out in public, even if I act a little outrageous, I'm not going to get shot by somebody who just doesn't. So we should have the freedom to, kids going to school should have the freedom to go to school without having to learn how to duck and cover, from shooters. I mean, it's like, if anything, the NRA has constrained our freedoms, has created a nation of people who are fearful, and rightfully so. There's more guns in America than there are people. Julian, thank you. That was a great, kind of synthesis of responsibility and freedom in the context of a community. I love it. Thanks. We'll be right back. Hey, my new book is out, The Hidden History of American Oligarchy, Reclaiming Our Democracy from the Ruling Class. Want to know more? The links are all over at thomhartmann.com. Back in the 1950s, or maybe it was the early 60s, I'm pretty sure it was the late 50s, Congress passed a law saying that if churches want to maintain their nonprofit status, if they don't want to have to pay taxes on the millions and billions that they're raking in. I mean, Pat Robertson is now a billionaire from donations and things, from tax exempt contributions. Right? If you want to keep that money tax free, if you don't want to have to pay taxes on it, if you don't want to have to pay local taxes, you don't want to have to pay sales taxes, you don't want to have to pay property taxes, if you want to be tax free, there's only one thing you have to do, churches, and that is don't engage yourself in politics. Because politics is how tax policy is made, and it's just not right. If we're going to subsidize you, all of us taxpayers, you don't engage yourself in politics. Well, in 2017, Trump issued an executive order basically telling the IRS, don't enforce this rule. We've got a whole rant about it up at thomhartmann.com for supporters of our program. Check it out. Welcome back. So this is what Franklin Roosevelt said. This was July 27th, 1936. And he said, that very word, freedom, in itself and of necessity, suggests freedom from some restraining power. In 1776, we sought freedom from the tyranny of a political autocracy. And then he goes on about that. And then he says, and so it was to win freedom from the tyranny of political autocracy that the American Revolution was fought. Since that struggle, however, man's inventive genius released new forces in our land which have reordered the lives of our people. And he talks about the age of machinery and railroads and steam and electricity and telegraph and radio and mass production. And then he says, for out of this modern civilization, economic royalists carved new dynasties. New kingdoms were built upon concentration of control over material things. Through the use of corporations, banks, and securities, new machinery of industry and agriculture, of labor and capital, all undreamed of by the founding fathers. The whole structure of modern life was impressed into this royal service. And then he goes on to talk about freedom again. He says, there was no place among this royalty for our thousands of small business owners and merchants who sought to make worthy use of the American system of initiative and profit. They were no more free than the worker or the farmer. Even honest and progressive-minded men of wealth, aware of their obligation to their generation, could never know just where they fitted into the dynastic scheme of things. And then this is amazing. He says, it was natural and perhaps human that the privileged princes of these economic dynasties, thirsting for power, reached out for control over government itself. They created a new despotism and wrapped it in the robes of legal sanction. In its service, new mercenaries sought to regiment the people, their labor, and their property. And as a result, the average man once more confronts the problem that faced the Minuteman. An old English judge once said, necessitous men are not free men. Liberty requires the opportunity to make a living decent according to the standards of the time. A living which gives man not only enough to live by, but something to live for. He just keeps on going, right? He says, for too many of us, the political equality we had once won was meaningless in the face of economic inequality. A small group have concentrated into their own hands and almost complete control over other people's property, other people's money, other people's labor, other people's lives. Life is no longer free, liberty no longer real. Men can no longer follow the pursuit of happiness. Against economic tyranny such as this, the American citizen could appeal only to the organized power of government. And then he says, today we stand committed to the proposition that freedom is no half and half affair. If the average person is guaranteed equal opportunity in the polling place, he must have economic opportunity in the marketplace. And then he gets to the real punchline, which I used to play on this show all the time. These economic royalists complain that we seek to overthrow the institutions of America. What they really complain of is that we seek to take away their power. Our allegiance to American institutions requires the overthrow of this kind of power. In vain, they seek to hide behind the flag and the Constitution. In their blindness, they forget what the flag and the Constitution stand for. Now, as always, they stand for democracy, not tyranny, for freedom, not subjection, and against a dictatorship by mob rule and the overprivileged alike. Absolutely amazing. Marco in Los Angeles. Hey, Marco, what do you have to say?
What I have to say is that what's being danced around here is one's right to exist. And that happens through liberties with the rules, statutes, and laws that we have. And on January 6th, we have the enemy of justice is violence. That's what occurred January 6th. It was when you take away those rules, statutes, and laws, you just set them aside. It's done. You're a done deal.
Yeah. Well said, Marco. Thank you very much. Janine on Big Island, Hawaii. Hey, Janine, you have the last minute. Your thoughts?
Thank you. I've talked about this for a while. Freedom can really only exist within an agreed-upon framework or a structure. Very similar to the way you talked about driving. If we were totally free to drive however we want, it would be mass chaos. Everybody would crash into each other, drive on the wrong side, go through stop signs. We have an agreed-upon framework for driving free. As long as we agree to the rules of the road, we can drive anywhere we want, but only within that framework. Another example is like people that have open relationships or something. They have an agreed-upon framework. Without that structure, we can't have it. We have to have that structure, and in that we can have freedom. Otherwise, it's chaos. We have to agree.
I got it, Janine. And that, very well said. Thank you very much. Thanks so much for being with us today. We'll continue this conversation and others tomorrow. And we have a new member of Congress who's going to drop by and take your calls for an hour at the beginning of the show tomorrow. It's going to be fascinating. So a brand new progressive member of Congress, brand new to our show. So get out there, get active, tag You're It. We'll see you tomorrow. Have a great afternoon.
You've been listening to Thom Hartmann. For audio and video archives, visit thomhartmann.com.
These companies support the Thom Hartmann Program. They are CB Distillery, CBD for sleeping. More info at cbdistillery.com, code TOM. The Clean Phone Pro, phone sanitizer and charger. More info at thenewdealshop.com. Plexiderm, real science, real results. More info at plexiderm.com, code TOM. ExpressVPN, the VPN that just works. More information at expressvpn.com/Tom. Gabby takes the pain out of insurance shopping. More info at gabby.com/Tom. HelloFresh, the #1 meal kit delivery service. More info at hellofresh.com, code TOM. And Superbeats, heart chews for heart-healthy energy. More info at superbeatsradio.com/Tom.
We say fight back!